Good morning, everybody. It is now 10:04 a.m. on December 21st, 2020, and I hereby call this meeting of the Climate Initiatives Task Force to order. Charles or Lindsay, would you please advance to the next slide? Just a few meeting logistics. This meeting is being recorded and live streamed on the internet on our YouTube channel for the benefit of the public. Members, please leave your cameras on and be present in this meeting. Please include your affiliation in your Zoom account. You can right click and rename just to help others identify who's speaking. Please keep yourself on mute when not speaking. Only use the chat box to let the GOCA staff know if you're having any technical difficulties. And if you have any substantive comments to make, please verbalize them for the benefit of the public. Please hold your questions until the end of each agenda item or at the end of an appropriate slide, just to have smooth administration of this meeting. And if we do get Zoom bombed, we will attempt to root that person out. And if we cannot, then we will shut the meeting down and reschedule. Public comments will be accepted before and during the live stream of the meeting. Comments may be submitted via email to climate@la.gov. In the subject line of your email, you must include a reference to the Climate Initiatives Task Force and the agenda item if applicable. In the body, please include your name and address before your comment, just so we can identify you. The comments will be read aloud. I will note that public comment is very important, and in order to improve the public participation process, we are looking at ways to improve our software capabilities to allow for the public to verbalize their comments. So assuming we are meeting in January virtually, which it looks like it may be the case, we will look to have better capabilities for public participation. But I will be sending out some more details on that once that's finalized. And so with that, Mr. Sutcliffe, will you please advance to the next slide and call the roll?
Yes. Harry Vorhoff for the governor's office.
Present.
Colette Pichon-Battle.
Present.
Gregory Bowser.
Present.
Jonathan Berg.
Present.
Dr. Chuck Brown.
Present.
Dr. Virginia Burkett. Selby Bush. Dr. Terrence Chambers. Flozell Daniels.
Present.
Jay Darden. Mark Moses.
Mark Moses is here.
Okay, thank you. Karen Gautreaux.
Here.
Tyler Gray.
Here.
Bryn Haas.
Brent Haas is here.
Timothy Hardy.
Present.
Thomas Harris. Where's Jason Lanklow on?
Charles, I'm here. This is Jason.
Thank you. Camille Manning Broom. Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar.
Here.
Thank you. Don Pearson. Do we have Brad Lambert on for Don Pearson?
Brad Lambert is here.
Thank you. Bill Robertson.
Present.
Jeff Schwartz.
Present as well.
Mike Strain. Or Joey Bro for Mike Strain. Okay, Robert Burchick.
Present.
And Dr. Sean Wilson.
Present.
Thank you.
Right, we have a quorum, and I would like to note, Selby Bush, I see your name on here, but didn't hear you're on mute, so you weren't able to verbalize that you are present.
Hi, I'm so sorry. I was on mute. I'm here.
All right, thank you. Just trying to make sure we capture your presence. We have a very full agenda for today. It's been a very busy 6 weeks since the first task force meeting. And I want to welcome you all here today. And I don't want to spend a lot of time with a long windup, but I do want to remind everyone involved on the task force and its committees and advisor groups, as well as the general public and those watching today, the purpose, vision, and values of this effort. Because it's critical to keep these things front of mind as we do our work. Governor John Bel Edwards created this task force to identify a suite of balanced policies and strategies to meet the greenhouse gas emissions targets identified in his executive order, which will set Louisiana on a path to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. In order to do that, this effort will follow the science and welcome all stakeholders. And while I'm sure members will have differing ideas and opinions throughout this planning process, we need to recognize that we are all coming to the table in good faith. We need to refrain from speaking over each other in our discourse, and we need to speak to one another with respect. While it is easier said than done, this task force is striving to build consensus in its recommendations, recognizing that it is through consensus that best positions those recommendations to actually be implemented and not just end up on a shelf somewhere. Being driven by consensus means that we will all need to be flexible and willing to possibly give up your favorite idea if there's another that meets your core needs. And we'll be having a discussion of those core needs later on in the agenda under fundamental objectives. But we all need to keep these things front of mind throughout this planning process. And so on the moving on to review of the agenda, on the screen is an overview of the agenda. The official agenda that was posted has the committees and advisory groups listed out as well. And that is part of the official agenda. In accordance with the open meetings law, it would require unanimous approval of the task force to change the agenda as it was publicly noticed. So with that, does anyone have any changes to the agenda that they would like to propose? Hearing none, we will move to approval of the minutes. I hope everybody had a chance to review the minutes over the weekend. Does anyone have any changes to the draft minutes that they would like to propose at this time?
I'll make to approve the agenda or the minutes, excuse me.
All right, we have a motion to approve the minutes as drafted. Is there a second?
I'll second.
I think there was the motion by Ms. Gotro, a second by Rob Verchik. Any discussion? Any public comment? And so, Ms. Cooper, can you please just check the climate@la.gov email to see if there is any public comment so we can comply with the open meetings law? Just wait a moment.
Yes.
Mr. Chairman, while we're waiting, Virginia Burkett just joined.
Thank you. Welcome, Dr. Burkett.
Mr. Chairman, we have no public comments.
All right, we have a motion to approve the minutes. Second, no public comment, no discussion. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed, say nay. The ayes have it. Minutes approved. Moving right along to committee reports. As I mentioned, it has been a very busy 6 weeks since the first task meeting, and I want to thank the more than 100 people who are volunteering on these advisory groups and committees, in addition to the 23 members of the task force who also sit on those advisory groups and committees. As a reminder, these advisory groups and committees were set up to provide subject matter insights to help inform the task force. Their first meeting centered around refining their charge as well as identifying fundamental objectives for the task force to consider, which were synthesized into the list that was distributed to all of you and will be discussed under agenda item number 8. Members will have an opportunity to ask questions and share their input at the end of each committee report. As a refresher, and moving to the next slide, the general committee charge is to develop and evaluate emissions reduction proposals and create implementation strategies to reach the short, medium, and long-term greenhouse gas emission reduction goals that are spelled out in the executive order. And so with that, I will move down the list, and we'll be starting with agriculture, forestry, conservation, and waste management. Ms. Gotro or Mr. Bro, would you lead us off in committee reports?
Sure. I'm going to kick off the first part of the discussion, and my co-chair, Joey Bro, will continue. Just briefly, our committee met on December 4th, and we examined the charge, which was to examine opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon storage capacity through agriculture and forestry practices, conservation measures that promote natural carbon sinks, blue carbon opportunities, and waste management. And I will say that we have a great cross-section and a wonderful amount of expertise, and many of these members on our committee, I'm not going to read their names, but have worked together and are very enthusiastic about their charge. We have representatives from the public sector across our topic areas, and we have representatives from federal and state agencies, and we had a very robust discussion. We used up all of our time, and I was very grateful that many of the members, when invited, had further commentary through our deadline the following Monday or Tuesday. But very excited about working with this committee, and I will turn it over to Joey to talk about some of the results of our discussion, our first discussion. Is Joey on?
See Joey's name popped up, but can't hear you, Joey.
Well, I'll be glad to continue if Joey can't.
Now.
There, thank you.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, y'all. I have to unmute in like 3 different places, but I finally got myself clear. Like Karen said, it was a pretty good discussion, and a little bit of a revelation to a lot of the ag group was that the focus here was going to be primarily on emissions reduction rather than sequestration, which is normally what they see first or what they think of the most regarding their role from an ag perspective in climate change or a climate initiative such as this. But we did have a good discussion on emission reduction potential within the ag group and creating or furthering opportunities there, mainly regarding equipment management and upgrades, that sort of thing. And science-based tillage and residue management opportunities beyond those that may exist currently in Farm Bill programs, and just attaining an overall reduction in the ag implementation footprint per sector or per agronomic within the agricultural realm. And there was some discussion about managing forests, woodlands in general, and wetlands for optimal carbon storage potential, whether that means enhancing understory to native ecotypes, whatever scenario might get us the biggest bang for the buck regarding emissions reductions and carbon sinks there. And in production forestry, I think it's probably going to be a tougher thing. There wasn't a lot of discussion there, but touching on beneficial use of waste wood / things like that. And of course, there was some discussion on enhancing herbaceous wetlands, inland and coastal, especially through the Coastal Master Plan, implementation of vegetative enhancements there. There was some discussion, of course, about developing and encouraging and furthering conservation practice incentives for landowners, again, including and beyond those that may already exist in the current Farm Bill, especially the EQIP program. And this all in regards to the scenario or the situation that most producers would be in that aren't already doing this type of work, tillage and residue management and that sort of thing. startup costs may be prohibitive until they start to see crop responses to increased soil carbon accruals, that sort of thing. And finally, some discussion about proper outreach and education, not only for producers regarding their on-farm benefits and carbon sequestration and emission reduction potential, but to the public on these benefits as well as the many on and off-site benefits that go along with these type practices, including, or in addition to emission reductions, we'd be looking at flood management, water quality, water detention, habitat enhancements, and that sort of thing. And also to keep them as included and up to date as possible on the goings-on of the climate initiative here. And unless Karen or Lindsay have anything to add, that's all I have there.
That was a great summary, Joe.
Thank you both. Any questions or comments from the task force members? Okay, hearing none. Thank you very much for your report out. We'll move right along to land use, buildings, and housing. Camille Manning-Broom and Gina Campo are the co-chairs of that committee. I know I saw Gina, you were on here. You are on mute right now.
Got it. Sorry. Trying to deal with this laptop. Morning. So we did have, the committee did have our first meeting on December 7th. It was a very good discussion. We identified a number of very important areas of investigation that we are formulating our charge from, and we should have that for our next meeting. But essentially, the committee felt that, in essence, we need to determine what changes or improvements to land use patterns and building regulations are needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate future risks from climate change impacts while increasing resilience to individuals and communities and encouraging equity. So in a nutshell, that's basically our charge at this point. Some of the most important things that we talked about are that the state really doesn't have a direct authority or ability to regulate land use statewide. So that we do need to look at the areas that we can influence land use through our operations, regulations, et cetera, and that we can incentivize smart growth and land use decisions that are actually going to make a difference in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A lot of this is through decision making at the state level with respect to transportation and infrastructure investment, housing programs, and also economic development activities. And this is where we felt that, or the committee felt that we could show strong leadership on a statewide level. The committee also felt it is critical for us to evaluate programs, state programs, and find opportunities to incentivize climate-friendly land use patterns and construction practices and smart housing to reduce emissions. So essentially, as you can see, the committee already determined that land use is inextricably connected to the development of critical infrastructures such as transportation, power, and also housing. And so the committee stressed the importance of conducting cross-committee meetings with the transportation, power production, and economic and financial committees to develop joint recommendations. We feel very strongly that we need to act on this because collaboration across the committees will be key to producing recommendations that are aligned and actionable and can be implemented. Also, there was a lot of discussion about equity in housing, equity in access to services, and also to make sure that while we are increasing resilience, that we're increasing resilience across the board, and that we're also providing access and accessibility to those things that are going to save our communities and mitigate future losses in an equitable manner. So we look forward to coordinating with the Equity Advisory Committee because all of the recommendations that come out of this committee should be centered around people and equity. And we need to make sure that the communities that are bearing a lot of the brunt of climate impacts are not left out of the solutions or the benefits that we develop and recommend. We do have, like I said, a draft charge, and we will be honing in on that and adopting that at our next meeting. So those are key points, and we look forward to continuing our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Campo. Any questions from the members? Comments? Okay, hearing none, we will move to manufacturing and industry, which is co-chaired by Mr. Tim Hardy and Jason Myers. I believe, Mr. Myers, you will be given the committee report.
That is correct. Good morning, everyone. Just want to report back from our committee meeting the other day. We had our first meeting on December 14th, last Monday. In addition to me and Mr. Hardy, we have 11 others, and it seems like we have a very good mix of both industry, environmental groups, trade groups, and also from academia. So we had very good discussions. We talked about our charge, and we refined that a little bit. Go to the next slide. So we spent quite a bit of time speaking about our charge the other day. In particular, our charge is to examine opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions within the manufacturing and industrial sectors, including chemical manufacturing, petroleum manufacturing, petroleum refining, liquefied natural gas, and other operations. We spent quite a bit of time trying to decide whether or not petroleum refining and also liquefied natural gas refining actually fit into our group here. And the general consensus was it did, that we would include those areas in our charge. And we're also going to look for opportunities to deploy cleaner sources of energy, to fuel operations, enhance efficiencies, reduce unintentional releases, capture and sequester or reuse emissions, offset emissions, and other measures that will reduce net emissions from combustion and non-combustion manufacturing and the industrial activities in Louisiana. And as we talked, we moved on to our fundamental task, and we really spent a lot of time too speaking about what we can do as far as while meeting our charge in order to accomplish this. And a lot of the discussion was about going above and beyond. And actually, as we meet our goals and we move to net carbon zero environment here, that would make our products, the products that we manufacture here in Louisiana, much more valuable for companies who are also looking to do the same elsewhere. So we looked at really kind of trying to see if we can go above and beyond while we're meeting these goals, and also to move forward to where we are making things a lot better for our manufacturing and state at the same time. So as we move forward, I think we're going to have those in our mind, in the back of our mind, so that we can try to reach our goals. And as far as anything else, I think that's all that we have, unless Tim would like to add anything. We used all of our time. We went over the 2 hours. We ended up with 5 public comments. So I think we had a very, very good discussion, and I'll just leave it at that.
All right. Any comments to Mr. Myers' report out?
If I may,
Please.
just to expand a little bit, when you look at our charge and we look at deploying cleaner sources, of course, that's beyond just fossil fuels. Enhancing efficiencies is good for the environment and for industry. If there are ways we can do it and utilize less of our sources and lower emissions, that's of course good for both. Maybe in terms of reducing unintentional releases, that can be accomplished maybe through audits. We can look at our facilities closer and see how we might be able to put fixes in place that will present those, capture and sequester. Well, we've talked about that a lot and we'll hear about it a lot. But in terms of putting it into the subsurface or even using some of that carbon dioxide to make new products, and offsetting emissions is typically done only with in the non-attainment issue. There might be a possibility in talking with Dr. Brown and folks at the EQ through EPA, they maybe have an offset program that's beyond just non-attainment areas and looking at other measures. So I will agree with Jason very much. We had a fantastic comments, great cooperation, and I look forward to continuing the discussions, especially through this committee and the task force. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hardy. Any comments or questions from the other members? Hearing none, we'll move to mining, oil, and gas, which is co-chaired by Jason Longclaw and Brent Campbell. And I believe, Mr. Longclaw, you are giving the committee report out.
Yes, sir. Harry, thank you so much. I think that this committee is probably a first cousin of Mr. Hardy and Mr. Myers. A lot of the discussion that we had is very similar in nature in terms of just the makeup of the committee, and I think the overall charge. And I think that they're going to be working very closely, obviously, together and with the larger group, because our goals of this is to look at a comprehensive approach for how do we work with business and industry on an overall strategic goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the Mining, Oil, and Gas Committee, we have a tremendous makeup of small operators, mid-level operators, and some large operators on the manufacturing and industry side and oil and gas side. We have friends from the Environmental Defense Fund and just a really university representation as well. I think that the committee is going to be a very good makeup to look at this, because I think that our charge is obviously fairly immense when you look at the number of industrial emission sources in Louisiana. And we talked a little bit about that. And I think that with over 200 million tons, we have a tremendous opportunity here to work with business and industry. We've made significant strides already. And I think that the premise of this committee and the bulk of the discussion focused on how do we work with business and industry to do this in a very calculated manner and to work towards this goal of net zero by 2050. And I think the consensus of the group is that obviously we have some significant challenges, and that we're going to have industries that are probably going to be easier to work with and have some kind of low-hanging fruit type projects that come off the board fairly early to try to work on these efficiencies and opportunities. And then we're going to have some difficult ones. I think we're going to have some industries that are harder to capture and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I think that that's part of the overall challenge, is to try to look at all available technologies, try to make sure that we have a very comprehensive approach, and that we come up with solutions, and not just go into this with, just the singular goal in mind, but actually be able to work together towards common goals that make sense. And I think that with the technologies in play, there's so many that are developing right now that we're I guess looking at a comprehensive any and all approach to try to make sure that we consider sequestration, that we consider all the different opportunities to work with business and industry. And I think that when we do that, we're going to achieve those goals. And I think that with this group, the discussion hinged upon, trying to make sure that we consider all different industries, and that, a lot of these emissions reductions that right now, a lot of them have significant costs. So we need to look at federal tax incentives. We need to look at what the state can possibly do from a policy standpoint. And again, the overall goal is to work together towards that charge. So when you look at what this committee is made up of, we have transportation operators, we have our department, which has orphan wells and some of the other things that we're working on, and just looking at each one of these different sectors, how we can best come up with a path forward on emissions reduction. So I was very encouraged by the discussion. Again, I'm co-chairing this with Brent Campbell from the Department of Natural Resources and the Office of Conservation. And I think that with the group that we have and with the overall committee thing, one of the other things that we talked about is the interplay among all the different committees. In other words, how can we be most effective with producing something that works hand in hand with the other committees? And I think that our charge is to do that. The discussion was good. We had some great public comments as well. And again, I think that as of right now, the group has a very clear objective to try to make sure that we consider any and all available technologies, and again, work together toward the overall goals of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that's what I have for today related to report outs. Look forward to working with you all on the next meeting and next report out.
Okay, thank you very much. Any questions, comments?
Mr. Chair, this is Tyler Gray with Lamoga. I have just a quick question about after going through both of those committees and talking about, sort of what the charges were and things like that. Do you mind elaborating a little bit on how it relates to the sort of the compiled fundamental objectives document? I'm just trying to figure out the best way to make comments as we go through this, whether that's through a written submission following the overall report, or if it's something just to bring up individually, just try to get a sense of how we're providing feedback.
Sure, and I'll elaborate more fully when we hit that agenda item number 9. But our thinking is that we want to focus everyone's time today on kind of perhaps the fundamental objectives that were listed out that give folks the most heartburn or need to be reworked. And if you have thoughts on just wordsmithing, to just send those to staff in order to consider, and we'll provide another look to the membership of this task force next month in a more complete form. And what we provided on Friday was a list that was really unfiltered from the discussions that were had at the committee meetings. And so this is an opportunity to provide a discussion of those. And I think if we can keep it at a higher level to focus on the most important ones, or where folks might have disagreement, and then keep the wordsmithing to email submissions, if that makes sense.
Yes, no, it does. And I appreciate that clarification. And I apologize for jumping ahead to the next agenda item. For the wordsmithing, I'll just plan to submit a follow-up document. And just a quick comment, considering both sector committees, appreciate them finding clarification around the petroleum refining sector to take ownership there. And also hearing a lot of the comments and from Mr. Hardy's comments earlier, and that group really liked the idea of focusing on the modernization of our current and existing infrastructure. So I just wanted to make that point from a higher level, looking at all these, just sort of the concept that I keep hearing over and over again is that modernization. So I just wanted to touch on that and appreciate that opportunity.
All right, thank you. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Jason, thanks for the report. It's actually really interesting. It's good to hear. I have a question. You mentioned that in sort of the scope of your charge, you're looking at the related issue of economic health and costs, which of course, is right on. We should be doing that. Did you also talk about looking at the related public health and safety issues?
As of right now, Rob, I think that that's going to be on the table as well. And I'd like to clarify. So for public health, that obviously factors in the overall when we look at, I think the study on the greenhouse gas emissions is going to kind of give us a lens on where those areas are, first off, in terms of big focus areas. That would be that next step when we start going through the process, is to actually look at, individual community effects, et cetera. If you reduce emissions in a particular area, how that affects the overall community health, et cetera. But I mean, that would be my thoughts off the top of my head. But I mean, obviously we have an industrial corridor where the bulk of some of these emissions are located. And I think that that's where having DEQ and our partners there, working on that overall emission strategy in terms of those key those key big items in terms of if we achieve goals very early on with maybe some of the largest sources, then that potentially may have the, the quickest health effect, I guess, if you could look at it like that. Again, that's something that'll definitely be on the table.
Yeah, I'm sorry. And just just to follow up, is the safety, does that also relate to safety in the workplace and safety of employees?
Yes, and I think that for us, I mean, it's also the safety of the technology, right? So through each one of these, in terms of the projects, is making sure that we have good permitting, regulatory processes, and obviously the safety in every portion of how we do this is absolutely critical.
Excellent, thanks.
Great questions. Any others? All right. Hearing none, we will move on to power production, distribution, and use, which is co-chaired by Bill Robertson and Jonathan Berg. I'm not sure who's going to lead off this committee report.
Hey, good morning, Harry. This is Jonathan. I'll go ahead and kick us off, and Bill can add to our discussion. Our first meeting of the Power Production, Distribution, and Use Committee, which effectively is the utility committee. We in fact talked about how that name might limit us, so we'll get into that. But our first meeting was last Monday, a week ago, December 14th. A great participation. We took over the 2-hour allotted time frame. We have a good, diverse committee. Me as one of the co-chairs coming from the utility side, and we have all 3 of the IOUs represented, the investor-owned utilities as well as the co-ops. We have representation from our market participants, which the MISO market, which at least 2 of the IOUs and the majority of the co-ops participate in. And then we have participation from various consumer groups, including the Alliance for Affordable Energy. We have the industrials represented through a representative from the LEUG, the Louisiana Energy Users Group. We have industry represented as well as academia. Professor Verchik, who's on the task force, he is also a member of our committee. So it's a nice, diverse set of interested parties in the utility space. And we had a really good discussion last Monday. And I'll go into kind of some of the things we talked about. I think, yeah, so one of the things, we want to do is capture kind of the plans and proposals and even commitments that have already been made within the utility space, and see how that relates to our fundamental objectives that will come from this committee. And so we'll take that and then, of course, explore additional ways to reduce greenhouse emissions within the utility space. And then as far as specifics go throughout that, we're of course looking to encourage the growth of renewable energy within Louisiana, both at the utility and for end use customers. Also investigating opportunities to increase efficiencies and reduce emissions within the existing utility space and the current portfolio of the various utilities. And then a lot of discussion about other things that we will be looking at as far as meeting our goals for emission reduction, whether that be through electrification efforts, which are growing rapidly. A big discussion we had was as far as our committee name is Production, Distribution, and Use, but almost all of the committee members brought up the fact that we should be looking at transmission. So the bigger power lines and how we can export or import renewables to meet our goals. That transmission network could provide a backbone to opening doors for additional renewable technologies. So we got into some of those specifics, and again, at this point, it's kind of keeping that high level and exploring all those opportunities to meet our goals on top of those commitments and goals that have already been stated by the utilities across the state. And then, of course, we're going to have to explore how this kind of changing dynamic of resource providing for utilities affects the operations within the state. How energy demand, another topic we discussed the specifics is energy efficiency opportunities to reduce demand. But then again, as you start introducing some of these renewables more than is currently within Louisiana, you got to think about how that affects operations and reliability for the grid. And then I think last but not least, and this was, it kind of goes to Professor Verchik's last comment. One thing that throughout all this and our focus, is on reducing emissions, obviously, but we have to continue to explore and evaluate, how this affects all aspects of a utility customer's life, really. And so, maintaining affordability and reliability while we explore these different emission reductions is going to be very important to our discussions as a committee, because the end use customer sees all of that. They want reliability, they want affordability, and we all want to reduce emissions. So really robust discussion. We'll continue to hone in on our core objectives and our scope as we continue to meet, and look forward to working. One aspect that clearly came out is our, obviously we'll be working across sectors, because a lot of our utility users are within those two sectors that we just discussed. So look forward to working with everybody as we continue to work through this process. And Bill, I'll turn it over to you if you have anything to add.
Having someone from the task force speak at an upcoming meeting of the Public Service Commission. I think it'd be important to hear that phrase, climate change, uttered at a commission meeting, and get the commissioners to be aware of what we're trying to do as a task force and how that impacts their work. So I'll be working with Mr. Vorhoff and Mr. Sutcliffe to make that happen, and Jonathan as well.
That would be great. Before I open it up for any questions, I am happy to hear that this committee does not feel constrained by the title of their committee. As somebody who helped draft that title, it was not intended to leave out transmission, and so please do not feel constrained. That transmission plays a critical role in reducing emissions and bringing on renewables, and so I appreciate y'all understanding that and including transmission as part of your charge.
Yep.
And with that, I will open it up to any questions. All right, hearing none, we will move to the last, but certainly not the least, committee, transportation. Flozell Daniels and Dr. Eric Calavoda are the co-chairs, and I'm not sure who is giving the report.
This is Eric Calavoda. I thought I heard Flozell on the phone on the call earlier, but he had sent me a text saying he wouldn't be able to participate. So I'll go ahead and handle the whole thing. Ours, as the name implies, covers the transportation sector and emissions reductions in the transportation sector. What you don't see in the charge is sequestration. We also will be talking about that as part of our recommendations that are going to come out. We had our first meeting on December 1st, and it was very interesting. Flozell and I kept quiet and let the membership speak, and it was a very interesting discussion. We got a lot of ideas. We have a very good committee. It's got wide representation from all across the state, North Louisiana, South Louisiana, and Central Louisiana. And we have most of the major modes are covered as well. The one thing we do not have is anybody from the rail sector, but there's enough of us that know enough about that sector to be able to handle that as well. So the things that that are important to us that we identified are as follows. We want to reduce fuel-powered transportation demand. And there was a lot of discussion about how can you reduce transportation demand. One is telecommuting, which many people have been doing during COVID. There's also ride share, increasing opportunities for walking and bicycling, which are human-powered transportation modes as opposed to fuel-powered. We also need to re-examine our public transportation systems to not only reduce greenhouse gas emissions from that particular sector, but we also want to increase ridership and look at better serving our citizens. We have an aging society, and there's going to be more and more need for public transportation as time goes on. And we also want people to be able to address their daily needs and fully participate in the workforce as well. Obviously, one of the key things is increasing energy conservation in the transportation sector. Kernel of wisdom we've all heard from our grandparents is waste not, want not. It goes back 500 years. And so conservation is key. It's also a way to leave an inheritance for our children and our grandchildren. Oil and gas is valuable. Those are valuable resources. They have a lot more use than just fuel. In being a transportation guy, that's where our asphalt comes from, and we use a lot of that as well. But there's also plastics and lubricants, and it's feedstock for a lot of other industries. So we need to make sure that our children and our grandchildren have an ample supply of those resources, and as we address climate change at the same time. We also want to diversify our transportation fuel sources. Let's not put all our eggs in one basket. We've done that in the past in Louisiana by putting all our eggs in the oil drum, and the bottom of the drum fell out, and then finances go in the tank. And so as we move forward with this, we want to have a diversified fuel source, not try to go all electric or something like that. We need more than just that. Again, we do want to address mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions. We're never going to go to zero emissions, so we're going to have to offset that through mitigation to some extent. And we have public rights of way that can be reforested and things like that. Those are ideas that we have. One of the issues that has come up and will continue to come up is right now transportation is funded by how many gallons of fuel we sell, gasoline and diesel fuel. As we reduce the number of gallons that are sold, the finances are going to drop. And so money has to come from somewhere to maintain the infrastructure. So we're going to have to talk about how to replace those revenues that are lost by implementing greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies. Got to come up with another way to fund transportation infrastructure. And lastly, nobody has a lock on ideas. We want to get as many ideas from the public as we can get. So that's our report. I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Great report. Any questions from our members or comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
Hello. Yeah,
yes,
this is Bill Robertson. I'm going to maybe throw Dr. Calavoda in the frying pan here, but I read recently that some legislators were proposing a gas tax increase over a period of time to be accompanied by a $400 a year fee on electric vehicles. Is this task force going to weigh in on issues like that? And if so, how do we do it?
Well, we are going to weigh in on issues like that. And I don't want to comment on that particular legislation, but one of the, there's a couple of ways to approach this. You can approach this through the government mandate mechanism, and some states are trying to do that. You can also address it from a market-driven standpoint. And one of the ways to encourage people to shift from gasoline and traditional diesel fuel to electric or biodiesel or hydrogen fuel cell or one of the other alternatives is to gradually increase the tax on gasoline and diesel fuel. And then the market will take over. You can't, if you do it too quickly, you're going to wind up harming poor people, because poor people are trapped in the used vehicle market. And so they don't go out and buy Teslas. They don't have money to do that. So any increase we have in the fuel tax, we have to account for that. What is the impact it's going to have on low income people who are really stuck in and may not have the opportunity to even use transit. Transit may not be available in their area. So they are having to drive themselves. And so one way to approach that is to gradually increase that, and maybe even use some of those proceeds to offset, say, part of the sales tax, particularly on food and residential utilities and things like that. The state doesn't charge a sales tax on that, but local government does, in most parishes at least. I know they do in East Baton Rouge Parish. So anyway, but that's in regards to a tax on electric or hybrids, which is what I believe that proposal had, that's an issue for discussion, because as more and more people shift to electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles or hydrogen fuel cell or whatever, they don't pay any tax. They're using the transportation system and they're not paying for it. They're not helping to pay for it. So there has to be a transition to a new way to charge people if we're going to stick with a user pay system, which is what we have now, or the other option is simply to fund infrastructure completely out of general fund revenues. That's the other option. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but yes, we're going to get into that. We're going to talk about that. We're not ready to make recommendations at this point, but we're definitely going to discuss it.
Yeah, and to piggyback on that answer, which I thought covered it quite well, is we are not operating in a bubble, and so we need to be responsive and at least understand what is being discussed elsewhere, either at the local, state, and federal level, or international level, as well. So, any other questions?
Mr. Chair, this is Tyler Gray with Lamoga. I would just draw, if we are going to have a discussion on individual pieces of legislation, especially coming out of an individual sector committee, I do have some concerns about that right off the bat. We do have individual organizations that analyze into pieces of legislation that are filed and require more analysis than just, how it all works comprehensively is something that should be considered. I do have some concerns about weighing in about something like a gas tax being filed by a legislator. My gut tells me that that's not something that we should weigh in on as a particular piece of legislation. Maybe an overall policy from a transportation perspective and moving towards a general direction of reducing emissions is one thing, but individual pieces of legislation I don't think is a good idea for this committee to weigh in on.
I think that's a fair point, and I think my comment was more in the general of understanding the different policies that are being discussed at the different levels, and not necessarily voting, and specifically trying to support or oppose any specific legislation, but just recognizing what is being discussed elsewhere.
Understood. Thank you for the clarification.
And Mr. Chairman, first of all, I'd like to just thank all the committees for a great start. I've been talking to folks from all over the country regarding climate change initiatives, and they're pointing to what we do in Louisiana as a good model. One of the things that's come up recently as this morning, when the stimulus money was allocated yesterday, there was none for states, but there's anticipation that there will be some in the next round. And one of the things that we all need to think of, each one of these committees, is how do we utilize any monies that may come to the states to enhance what we're already doing. As we talk about transportation, do we promote mass transit? Do we build out more EV infrastructure? Do we complete CO2 pipelines? Do we look at transmission for some type of on or offshore wind? So I want everybody to kind of put that into their mental Rolodex and maybe think about how we utilize some immediate funding that may be coming from the federal government for existing projects that we already have established versus going out and trying to create a new policy. Just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brown. That's a great comment. Something to keep front of mind for everybody as we move forward. Any other comments? All right, I think that closes out the committees, and we'll now move to the advisory group reports. And just to refresh everybody's memories, the general charge for the advisory groups is that they'll provide information and assistance to the task force and the committees generally, and as requested on questions that transcend individual committee categories. And these 4 advisory groups represent 4 areas of expertise necessary for all the sector committees as they work towards emissions reduction solutions. And so that's the general charge. And I know that was more specific charges were discussed by the advisory groups. And so we will start first with the Equity Advisory Group, which is chaired by Colette Pichon-Battle, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good morning, everyone. We were able to have our first equity group, advisory group meeting on the 8th, and we had a wonderful participation by, I think, a really strong committee. We're just getting started, but we were really able to get to know each other, learn a little bit about each other's background, and hear where folks were coming from. There was one public comment that I took very seriously, which was around having union representation, which I agree could really enhance where we go. But I think right now we've got some good folks moving. We've got, of course, Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar, who's on the phone right now. And we've also got a number of other folks from academic institutions, nonprofits, environmental groups, advocacy groups. So really good start on our committee. We were really honing in on the Equity Advisory Group charge. And we know for sure that our charge is to define climate equity in the context of Louisiana, climate change, and emissions reduction. It sounds simple, except as we looked around, the definitions on equity and how it's used around the US and broader vary. And so we really want to take some time and really define what we're talking about. We also know that we need to anticipate opportunities to increase equity and reduce inequities in the design and implementation of greenhouse gas reduction strategies. So this was not just about, this was many aspects of a conversation that wasn't just about, calling out when there was unfairness, but really using this group to innovate how we can bake some fairness and future advancement of equity into some of these strategies. We don't want to just point the finger. We want to, help to advance the ball down the field. We also know that we want to advise the committees and the task force by identifying how proposed strategies to reduce emissions may mitigate or exacerbate historic or systemic inequities. And quite frankly, Mr. Chairman, this was a deep discussion, considering our state, considering the reality of our state, the history of our state. These are one of the things, we just can't get away from. So how do we consider history while we keep our eyes on the prize going forward? I think some of the comments that have been made by some of the committees today, we're in deep agreement with, but we know it's going to be a little bit of work on this one. And finally, we want to assist communities in the development and the structure of strategies and mechanisms to ensure equitable measures that offer new opportunities for marginalized communities and to increase equity. And really what we're saying here is there's going to have to be a broader conversation. This won't just be an answer. There'll be multiple layers to a strategy to get to a place that might take us a little bit of time, but we've got to be committed to. I also want to just say thank you to some of the committee reports, especially the reports that said they wanted to work with Equity Group, because that was a deep part of the conversation. Equity has got to be everywhere. It's not a box to check off. It's got to be at the beginning, the middle, and the end. We've got to grow it. And so I'm looking forward to working with all of the groups to really advance that charge. I think I can just mention that we were able to talk a little bit about our objectives. And while we didn't get to any hard to find objectives, we were able to start parsing out what some of those objectives will be. This is just from the beginning of the group's discussion. And so we know we're going to have to build that out a little bit more. And I think there might be some space to talk about that later in this agenda. But, we're on a good start and we're feeling like we're headed in the right direction. But we also know we're going to have to figure out how to work with all the groups. But I think we've got the right team to do it. So that's all open to any questions. And Chief, if there's anything you would like to add, please, I want to welcome your voice into the space as well. But we're on a good start.
May I ask a question? This is Virginia Burkett.
Yes, please.
Yes, Colette, excellent report. I was wondering, when you talk about historic or systemic inequities, has your committee discussed yet human health dimensions of the solutions everything from, the beneficial effects on human health, which hopefully would be across the board, but any potential negative consequences in terms of fairness or outcomes that should be considered by the task force. It came up in our science advisory group. One of the public comments is that you don't have a medical expertise on your committee. And we kept thinking, well, the equity committee, has the representative from Ochsner's. Have you all talked about that? And can we consider that part of the scope of what you're looking at?
Thank you, Dr. Burkett. Yes, that was a huge part. And I think what was brought up by our medical expert was the cost of doing nothing, and also the cost of doing the wrong things. What are we spending in our health systems now in our current system, and what's happening, and also what's going to happen as climate change intensifies, right? Our communities are really going to feel the brunt of this, and how is this going to impact the health system? Yes, this is absolutely a huge aspect of the conversation, and not just talking about the health issues that we know about currently, but really thinking, especially in 2020, through this pandemic, what the future health challenges might look like that we're not really aware of. So that is an excellent question. That is part of our conversation, and I think it'll continue to be a part of the conversation. And the comments around health were very appreciated by other members of the committee who weren't even thinking, like sort of had that same revelation, like, oh, right, we should think about it from a different aspect. So yes, ma'am.
Good.
Thank you, Dr. Burkett. Great question, and great example of how this task force is really pulling all the threads together, and ensuring that all the committees and advisory groups are not working in silos. And this is really a forum to share those ideas across the committees and advisory groups. So thank you for that. Any other questions or comments? Okay, hearing none. Thank you very much for your report out. We will now move to the Finance Advisory Group, which is chaired by Brad Lambert.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, fellow task force members, committee members, advisory group members. The Finance Advisory Group held its first meeting on Tuesday, December the 8th. We met for almost 2 hours. I thought it was very impressive. We had full attendance of all of our members over Zoom. As you can see from the listing on the screen that's displayed, we're fortunate to have a very diverse group, representation from higher education, both the academic side as well as the workforce delivery side, regional economic development organizations, banking and investment communities, local government, as well as state government. Like many of the other committees and advisory groups, we had a robust discussion, contributions from all members. Everyone seems to be fully accepting of the task at hand, while recognizing there are many facets and dimensions to the issues that we're going to need to consider. And it's really, we're going to really need to put a lot of these issues through an economic and financial prism, fully evaluating all things like all the economic impacts, opportunity costs of proposed policies, broader market forces like ESG, technological advancements that seem to be pulling the renewable energy options along, and some at a pretty rapid pace right now, workforce implications, financing options, both in the private sector as well as the public sector, things like incentive policies. Is there a way to incentivize or de-risk potential options in this realm? So, I think we're off to a good start. We're all committed to this dual test. How do we reduce the impacts of climate change on Louisiana while preserving and then hopefully enhancing our economic standing and competitiveness? So we look forward to receiving input, the wordsmithing as Harry described, from other members of the task force, other committees, members of the public, as we work to finalize, hopefully in fairly short order after the first of the year, finalize these charges and objectives, and really begin to get on with the hard work before us. And Mr. Chair, that concludes my report, subject to questions or guidance. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? All right. Hearing none, we will now move to the legal group, which is chaired by Rob Verchick. Professor Verchick, take it away.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. The Legal Advisory Group met Monday morning on December 7th. And as you can see, we have just a super cross-section of people with law and policy expertise. We've got people from industry, from government, public, including the Public Service Commission, which is really important to us, people from the nonprofit community, and also broad support from various universities in the state. We spoke a lot about our scope and charge. In looking at the scope, we see our work as focusing on many different kinds of actions that might be taken, including actions by the governor himself, by the state legislature, by local governments, and by actors in the federal government as well. And we saw basically that our job, we're hoping to accomplish three different things. One, as I put it, is we're trying to avoid trouble. That is, we're trying to anticipate legal hurdles that might arise in the design, implementation, or outcome of gas emission reduction strategies, greenhouse gas emission reduction strategies. And that means making sure, in particular, I think, that there's really good supporting evidence for the policies and the frameworks that get put in. We want evidence that's robust and reliable, and that means that we're going to, I hope, be working and talking with folks on the scientific advisory group as well. That's going to be important. The second thing we want to do is improve good ideas. So we want to be working with members of steering committees to make sure that that this task force eventually has the most effective legal and policy mechanisms for achieving the goals that are identified. So that might mean sometimes you do it by enforceable standards. Sometimes it's economic incentives or tradable entitlements, or sometimes it's public disclosures and getting information out to the public. So however it is, we just want to make sure that all the tools are kind of used, or at least understood in the toolbox, and that these policies work as advertised, that they deliver the most bang for the buck, and that the processes are transparent, inclusive, and equitable. The last thing that we want to do is what I say is expand the winnings. There are supplementary goals that we have, and we want to make sure that to the degree we can get to those supplementary goals, we should. So if we have mechanisms that can create jobs or save lives, keep people out of the hospital, or protect the natural environment, we should be doing those things as well as working toward the goal of reducing carbon emissions. So, and I suspect we'll be working with the Finance Advisory Group and the Equity Advisory Group closely up to make sure that those supplemental strategies are worked out. I'm hoping that we have cross-cutting collaboration with all the groups we need to talk with early, so that we can build off of people's ideas early on. My last comment is that we only had one comment from the public, and that's just because we're getting started and we're just getting to know each other. But I would invite those watching who are members of the public and not on the committee to follow what we're doing and to contact us or to contact me if you have anything that you want to transmit, and I'll be looking for ways, as we all will, for broadening the public participation in all this. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Professor Verchick. Do any of the members have questions or comments? All right, hearing none, we will move to the Science Advisory Group, which is co-chaired by Dr. Virginia Burkett and Dr. Mark Zappi. And so Dr. Burkett or Zappi, I'm not sure who will be taking the lead.
Yes, I'll go ahead. This is Virginia. Yeah, I'm sorry, I had trouble connecting during the introductions, but I got in time for the approval of the minutes. Yes, Dr. Zeppi and I co-chaired our first meeting of the Science Advisory Group on December the 11th. And we had 14 out of 15 members present, and one missed only because her email address was wrong. So we have very good participation and very interesting discussion. We began with the discussion of, well, first we had a nice 30 minutes of introductions where each committee member gave a little background on their expertise. And that was interesting because you could see, cut across sectors and, a lot of deep expertise in the university community in Louisiana. So all these are Louisiana scientists that have agreed to serve as members. We presented the purpose of the committee and the charge to the committee. If you can go to the next slide there. There you go. So, providing this broad guidance to the governor's office and the task force is our primary charge, so that our strategies will collectively support the missions target in the governor's executive order. Then to stand back and review all of the proposed strategies developed by the sectoral committees for their scientific and technical merit, to provide guidance on the foundation used in the development in the interim and final reports. One of our tasks immediately is to provide the governor's office with documents that we feel will be the best references and source materials for the interim report that will be due in February. Looking across at different greenhouse gas reduction strategies and action plans developed by about 30 states, we're reviewing a selection of those and looking at what might be the minimum expectations for what would be included in the emission strategies developed by the sectoral committees. How to communicate uncertainties, units to be utilized so they're all additive, so that we can meet the targets in the order, the scientific justification, and glossary of terms, that sort of thing, so that it all comes together in the end with a cohesive report that makes sense to the public and can be tracked. To look at the core components of the strategies for consistencies across the groups and ensure that they are cumulative across sectors, including sources and sinks. And then to coordinate and interact with experts from sectoral committees. A lot of that has been mentioned earlier. The people that you have that are actually doing the work in the weeds to develop the solutions and the numbers that go along with them. And then finally, to look at the greenhouse gas inventory that you're going to hear about shortly and the plans for updating that. So the Science Advisory Group's been asked to look at that. After we went through our invited comments on our purpose and our charge, we had a really good discussion on two major topics. One, the subject matter experts, like, who's going to have what, and the whole premise that the sectoral committees will have their own subject matter experts, and we just need to be able to review them and provide, overarching technical and scientific guidance for the reports and their development. And seeing the charges and the roles and the discussion. As a matter of fact, I think we've got 38 people on the YouTube link. I think a lot of those are our Science Advisory Committee because they want to hear what the committees are doing, and particularly to hear Dr. Dismuke's presentation on the first greenhouse gas inventory that was done, that will be updated and that we will review. The second major point of discussion was around sinks and sources and the need to consider both. And everyone agreed to that. And then hearing the presentations this morning by the Ag, Forestry, and Conservation Committee, the Land Use and Buildings Committee, and even the Transportation Committee, that all are considering sequestration in addition to emissions is really good, because that all needs to be knitted together in the end to be considered in the overall targets. So all of those spoke about sequestration. It just underscores the need for communication and collaboration across the groups. So as we're reviewing the state plans, providing input to the governor's office for part 1 of the interim report, and we'll be meeting again in January. And our meeting went over the 2 hours with public comments primarily. We had a lot of public comments, and they centered on the committee expertise. And that's where that human health thing came out a couple of times in the public comments, and the importance of sinks. So it's good to hear. I think we're all on the same page of the importance of that. So unless, Harry, if you have any comments that you want to add, or if Dr. Zappi was able to be on the line, he may be on the YouTube link, I'm not sure.
Nothing from me. Dr. Zappi? But we can open up to any questions or comments from the members as well. Thank you, Dr. Burkett. Great report out. May have some follow-up questions kind of at the end of Mr. Dismuke's report and on the greenhouse gas inventory, because the Science Advisory Group is going to play an important role in really helping to steer that effort. All right. And so that concludes the committee's and advisory group reports. We'll now move to agenda item number 9, report on development of fundamental objectives for this task force. And in a moment, we'll hear from Lindsay Cooper and Charles Sutcliffe with the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities, and Dr. Alyssa Dousman with the Water Institute of the Gulf, which together and their colleagues all formed the planning team for this effort. And so today we're offering for the task force and the listening public a consolidated, synthesized list of the fundamental objectives that were raised across all of the different committees and advisory group meetings, including the very first meeting that we had with this group last month. And to echo some of what was said earlier by our committee and advisory group chairs, we have a really excellent group of experts on the different committees and advisory groups, and we had great discussion in all of those first meetings. I think you'll see, the experience and insights that reflected in the fundamental objectives that we'll be sharing in a moment. But before diving in, I would like everyone to remember that fundamental objectives are being formulated so that everyone involved in this effort and the general public recognizes the things that are most critically important to the many stakeholders involved in this process and that are critically important to the general public. The fundamental objectives will help us compare and evaluate emissions reduction policies and strategies. They'll help us consider the potential or likely consequences, both positive and negative, of those policies and strategies. Identifying fundamental objectives will increase transparency and help drive us toward consensus. And so what Ms. Cooper, Mr. Sutcliffe, and Dr. Dousman are going to walk you through now is an unfiltered reflection of the conversations that were had across all the different meetings held over the last 6 weeks. There are some objectives that are conflicting, which is to be expected at this stage. There's going to be a trade-off analysis later on as part of our process where we can confront those contradictions more head on. And it's important for everyone to know that this is not a final list. We're sharing this now as a report out and to begin to get a sense from this group which objectives we're comfortable with, identify some that may need to be tweaked, and identify others that may need to be reframed or reworked completely. And so between today and the next meeting in January, we will further refine these objectives based on the input that we received here today. We will be editing and revising this list and providing it back to the task force in January as part of the draft interim report, or slightly before if we're able. The interim report needs to be approved before the February 1st deadline, which is set in the executive order. And while we need to approve an interim report before that February 1st deadline, that doesn't close the book completely on fundamental objectives. If we get down the road and realize that we failed to identify something or need to tweak another, we can do so. And so, as I mentioned earlier, if you have any wordsmithing suggestions, please send those to staff after this meeting or before the end of the year, so we can really focus today's comments on the ones that need to be reworked or reframed completely, or that give folks the most heartburn. We will be pausing at the end of each slide to allow for comments from the members. And so with that, I'll turn it over to the planning team, Ms. Cooper, Mr. Sutcliffe, and Dr. Dousman.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, members. My name is Lindsay Cooper, and I work in the Governor's Office of Coastal Activities. As you can tell from this outline, and all of you received a draft of the objectives last week via email, we've divided the objectives into 7 different categories based on discussions that we had from the individual committee and advisory groups and the last task force meeting. And so this was just a way that we were able to group the different objectives that were discussed. But I envision as we work to refine and narrow into and rework and build upon some of the objectives that have been framed, we might even need to revisit these categories. So even these categories that I'll frame for you on this slide are they're up for discussion, and we can recategorize as we see fit. So starting in the first category, we have greenhouse gas emissions, and this was something very transparently put forth by all of our groups. And we divided that into greenhouse gas emission reduction and sequestration as well. And the next section is Louisiana residents and communities. Diving into that further is equity, and then short and long-term success, economy and private industry, and then turning to natural resources and environment and climate change adaptation. So as we work through this list, my colleague Charles and I will lead you through each of these sections. And as we work through this, if you have comments on the headers or how we're categorizing, please do let us know as well. And with that, I will turn it over to Charles to lead us in the first section.
Okay, thanks, Lindsay. So obviously, every committee and every advisory group noted that reducing emissions from their sector was a key outcome that we all needed to strive for throughout this process. So I think this slide should be come as no surprise. Members of the task force raised these objectives during our first meeting, and what is also interesting is that multiple committees, I think, raised the need to reduce emissions in sectors other than their own. So this reflects, I think, the interconnectedness of the different sectors. So for example, land use, buildings and housing, and mining and oil and gas all noted a need for lower emissions from the power production sector. And land use, buildings and housing also saw a need to lower emissions from the transportation sector as one of their fundamental objectives as well. As was mentioned earlier, we also heard a lot of good ideas that could be considered as means objectives throughout this conversation. So we're listing today the fundamental objectives, but we do want to kind of give you a sense that, you know, we did capture more notes from those conversations than is reflected here. And so as Lindsay and I go through this, we'll kind of share some of those means objectives just as a way to kind of give some more color to kind of what's being shown on the screen. So some examples of means objectives that came up in the category of emissions reductions across the different sectors included things like transitioning to lower emissions vehicles in agriculture and forestry, as well as soil management practices. We heard about increasing energy efficiency, increasing solar and wind power utilization, ideas for using trees to shade buildings to lower energy use while also reducing the urban heat island effect, and incentivizing emissions reductions that go beyond statutory or regulatory requirements was also mentioned in the manufacturing committee. And so I think everyone is represented here on this slide, and so I'll just kind of open that up for questions if there are any on this one.
I have just a quick general question, and that is, I'm wondering what significance, if any, going forward it is about what committees or groups came up with the objectives. In other words, as these objectives get adopted, is this something that everyone on the task force is then committing to, or is it for instance, in my own group, there are things I wish that we had said, that we had embraced, on here. And I'd like to think that all of these, are our objectives, and the same with other groups as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. The idea, the short answer is, these are fundamental objectives for the task force to adopt and would apply across the board for this whole planning effort. The goal was to sort of crowdsource the idea generation, and that is what we're trying to reflect, is that we heard these comments and kind of attribute to the appropriate committee, but just for more just to FYI than anything. Any other questions on this, or shall we move forward with the next slide?
This is Eric Calabota. I'm not a member of the task force, just the co-chair of the Transportation Committee, but there is on the compiled list, at the beginning, one of the questions we asked was, are we dealing just with emissions? Or are we also dealing with adaptation? And we were told, no, we're just dealing with emissions. Adaptation is being handled by somebody else, another task force. So I guess that question I need to repeat again, because you had that on the compiled list at the end. There was adaptation. Are we supposed to be dealing with both? Because that changes the game significantly. Are we just dealing with emissions reductions?
So our focus is on emissions reduction. That's the ultimate fundamental objective, if you will. But just as we're trying to capture as many co-benefits as possible, or avoid unnecessary costs, or at least capture and understand those costs, adaptation is one of those, similar to trying to increase health outcomes, or so it's more framed as a something we need to keep front of mind as we're evaluating the different strategies, and understand that adaptation could play into the mix. But it's there's still the ultimate focus of reducing emissions. Any other questions? Or I think we can move to the next slide.
Okay, great. So another component of greenhouse gas emissions, building on what Charles just mentioned from the reduction lens, is in greenhouse gas sequestration. And so from the different groups, again, this is just a report out of what we heard in a compilation from conversations. There were 3 different objectives that were developed from those discussions. One of those is to maximize emission recapture through carbon mitigation and sequestration, which was identified by the task force in their first meeting, also the Ag and Forestry Committee, mining and oil and gas and manufacturing industry all identified that one. They also identified some different ways to reach those, to reach that objective. And that could be done through maximizing opportunities for carbon negative and carbon neutral technology, recapturing carbon through agriculture and forestry practices, maximizing opportunities for natural climate solutions. So there were a lot of different means and ways that were discussed of how to reach that one. Another objective identified by the Finance Advisory Group was maximizing carbon sequestration from the built environment. And they offered that this could be done through sequestration from green vegetation and trees in urban spaces. And the final objective that was mentioned in this bin was from the task force in the first meeting on maximizing carbon sequestration from the natural environment. And this was in reference to blue carbon opportunities and sequestration. So those were the objectives identified on this bin. Are there any questions or additions from members? Hearing none, we'll move to the next one.
Okay, so this one on Louisiana residents and communities. I think the desire to center this work on positive outcomes for the people and communities of Louisiana was very apparent across all of the conversations at our different committees and advisory groups. And so to kind of start walking you through some of the specifics that came out, the task force, the finance advisory group, equity advisory group, land use, buildings and housing, manufacturing industry, and power production committees all saw this work as a means to maximize job opportunities and to provide support for workers across Louisiana. Specific mention was given to transitioning to emerging sectors, increasing job growth and the protection of existing jobs, and ensuring that our state benefits from that job opportunities associated with the shift to renewable energy. So those are some of the means that kind of came up under that one. A second one, fundamental objective that came up was maximizing access to reliable and affordable energy sources for consumers. That was lifted up by 5 different groups as well. And included under this fundamental objective are some means objectives that would focus on reliability, on affordability, and placing a minimal energy burden on households. It looked at, some other options are diversifying portfolios for energy production that include alternative fuels and biomass, as well as enabling self-supply through on-site cogeneration, and improving and modernizing the energy sector infrastructure, including transmission systems. As was raised earlier in this conversation, positive health outcomes and public safety also arose as a fundamental objective from 5 different committees, including the task force, ag and forestry, land use, buildings and housing, manufacturing and industry, and power production, distribution, and use. So that was one that we had this conversation somewhat, but I do want everybody to know that it came up multiple places as well. Some of the means there include healthy homes that don't contribute to poor health outcomes, improved indoor and outdoor air quality, promotion of activities that promote health like better walkability, minimizing pollution from power production, maximizing air quality in the vicinity of industrial facilities, and reducing human exposure to contaminants and greenhouse gas emissions. Moving down the list, the Transportation Committee, the Task Force, and the Legal Advisory Committee all raised the need to maximize access to affordable and reliable transportation that meets people's needs as a fundamental objective. So this included an appreciation of the different needs across multiple types of users, like people without cars or people in urban or rural environments. And the concept of better meeting people's needs was central too in conversations about on-demand transportation or network models of transportation, and so it kind of took on some detail there. Another fundamental objective in this category is to maximize affordable and sustainable housing. So that obviously relates to Louisiana residents and communities as well. This incorporates concerns about the short-term and the long-term costs of some potential proposals that might be include maintenance and repair, property taxes, and more. Another fundamental objective that we rose was cultural heritage. So that's another key value that came up in the task force and from the Land Use, Buildings, and Housing Committee. And one example there of a means objective under this would include an emphasis on historic buildings, for example. But there are many other things that we could also list there. And finally, Manufacturing Industry Committee identified the increased security of access to manufactured goods and the supply chain for Louisiana residents and from a national security perspective as a fundamental objective they listed. And with that, I'll take any questions. Okay, Lindsay.
But
Charles. Moving on to the next bin on equity, there were 3 different fundamental objectives that were identified by many groups in their conversations, particularly on this first objective. The task force, the equity and legal and finance advisory groups, as well as the land use, building and housing committee and the power committee, all identified that reducing disparities in future opportunities and outcomes across communities and people was a fundamental objective. And all of these groups offered some different means through which we could meet this fundamental objective. And a few of those were economic prosperity, including creation of job opportunities, economic mobility, affordability, and just transition. Other means offered were fair access to resources, including housing, energy, and transportation, and that the costs and benefits of climate action are distributed fairly now and for future generations. So those were a few ways to meet the first objective. The second objective identified by the task force, the equity and legal advisory groups, and the power committee was to maximize reduction of historic and structural inequities and their impacts for underserved and marginalized communities, including communities of colors and indigenous peoples. In different means, we could reach this objective by where improved quality of life for all people, reduced vulnerability to climate change impacts, and improved ability to recover from climate-related disasters. Other means were removal of structural barriers that inhibit health and health outcomes for all people, encouragement of anti-racist policies and actions, and reduction of climate-driven impacts for at-risk communities. And then the third objective identified by the Equity Advisory Group was to maximize engagement with and participation of communities in decision-making, which could be met through inclusion of people into the decision-making process from beginning to end, or provision of information through mechanisms accessible and informative to the community needs, and centering people and empathy in decision-making. And so again, I'll note that these were the equity objectives that were identified by the groups, but this might not encompass all aspects of equity that need to be included in these conversations. So with that, I'll open it to the floor on any additions or amendments. Hearing none, I'll hand it back over to Charles.
Okay, so the next kind of category that we've put up here has to do with short and long-term successes. And so the nature of our emissions reductions goals and this issue in general must balance urgency and immediate action with a simultaneous eye on the future. So laying the groundwork for future progress and goal attainment. And none of our work on this task force also matters much if we aren't identifying solutions that will actually work and solutions that can be implemented in the real world. I think everything on this list kind of has to do with one of those kind of ideas. Nearly every committee identified maximizing confidence in the outcomes of solutions and support for their implementation by the public and private industry as a fundamental objectives. Means to achieve this goal include leveraging data and information gleaned from experiences in other areas of the country or internationally, transparency with regard to the data that we are relying on and our process of evaluation, incorporating local knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge in our assessments, incorporating community input and feedback and solution development, and making sure that landowners and farmers, for example, understand the new technologies that are being proposed for them to use. A similar fundamental objective that arose was to maximize the efficiency and effectiveness of emissions reduction strategies. So again, leveraging data, information, and models to determine how well a strategy might work could be a means there. Looking to external skill sets or experiences, again, maximizing traditional ecological knowledge, building consistency across other ongoing climate adaptation strategies like the Coastal Master Plan is a means that could happen under this objective. As well as making sure that the strategies proposed can be enforced. It was also discussed that we could increase the tools available to state agencies to reduce emissions and look for more connections across industries or sectors to collectively reduce emissions. The next one is a desire to minimize the impediments to the implementation of strategies and to speed the implementation of strategies, which came up in 4 of our different committee meetings. Here, consensus building was seen as a means to this end, as was coordination across the public and private sector. Incentives were another means, and so was looking for a balanced approach. These are all things that have come up multiple times today and at other meetings. Several groups wanted to focus on low-hanging fruit and to identify impediments early on. And another means to achieve this fundamental objective was to focus initially on the biggest source of emissions first. And the last fundamental objective related to our ultimate success was to maximize the robustness of solutions in an uncertain future. Again, using data and science and a comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions inventory was crucial here, as were solutions that produced positive outcomes across multiple future scenarios. We wanted to keep options open to adopt new technologies as they become available, defining metrics to evaluate options was important, and so was the ability to revisit goals and strategies as needed. And so with that, I'll just see if there are any comments from the group.
Hey, Charles, this is Tyler Gray with Lamoga. Just a quick question on the first point. The only thing in listening to your comments around what that looks like, the only thing that I would ask is that when, that we ensure there's equity in any of the policy changes across Louisiana's economy and not targeting specific industries as we talk broadly about these things. So we talk a lot about equity and just want to make sure that it's in the same vein with the economy as well.
Thanks for that comment. That's point taken. Anybody else have anything to add? Okay, Lindsay.
Thanks, Charles. Moving on to economy and private industry, there were 6 different objectives that came from this category because this was emphasized by many groups throughout the conversations. So these are capturing conversations that occurred sector by sector. We recognize that there's a need to synthesize particularly this category in terms of the overall economic goals of our state. And we also recognize that there might be a need to refine how these are presented and worded and possibly clarify some of the means and the outcomes with that. But again, this is just reporting out what we had gathered from those conversations. And so in this first objective that was raised, this was presented by the task force, the finance advisory group, the manufacturing and industry committee, the power and the mining and oil and gas committee, that we would maximize potential for general economic growth. And some means that were raised to reach this were development of new business and industry, increased access to affordable and renewable power, maximizing investment in Louisiana communities, and improving the state's overall financial position. A second objective that was raised by the Power Committee and the task force was to maximize economic growth and shareholder value in the power production sector, which could be met through reduced reliance on foreign energy, encouraging electrification of other sectors, maximizing transition to renewable energy as well. Another objective raised was maximizing profitability within the agriculture and forestry sectors, which could be done through affordability of land management for landowners and financial incentive management practices that also reduce emissions. So taking that lens of understanding the burden on emission reduction for landowners and farmers. From another perspective, maximizing profitability in manufacturing and industry, which could be done through increased competitiveness on a national and global scale that meets demands for blue, green, and decarbonized products. Another option would be minimizing cost of implementing carbon reducing strategies. And from another lens raised by the Transportation Committee would be to maximize transportation options for shipments of goods. This is really maximizing the supply chain efficiencies through smarter use of transportation corridors. For example, on the freight side with rail shipping and barges, and on the passenger side with bus routes and delivery services. And then lastly, raised by the mining and oil gas, is that we would maximize profitability in that sector as well. And so those were the objectives posed in this category. And with that, I'll open it up to questions or revisions.
Hey, Lindsay, this is Tyler Grab. Sorry to keep talking. I just, the only comment that I would like to add to the overall scope of this, there's a lot, especially when it comes to the maximization of shareholder value out there for the entire private industry and the economy. A lot of that functions with the ESG, the environmental scorecards being used by some of the investments throughout the United States. So that's something to consider, is how that plays into making Louisiana attractive for investments such as those. And further in that point, a lot around the way that there's a lot of great discussion around increasing investment for new business and industry. One of the things that I think Louisiana, based on its current position and footprint with energy infrastructure, that there should be a heavy focus around the modernization of that infrastructure for existing business industry, especially those opportunities to minimize the cost of implementing carbon mitigation strategies, reducing leaks and emissions in all mediums, improve monitoring and response, and other improvements resulting in goals set forth by this task force. And we'll submit that language in writing, but I just wanted to make that point that I think it's important as part of this discussion.
Thank you for raising that, Tyler. I think that fits well in some of the means offered by these fundamental objectives. Any other comments from members?
Lindsay, this is Flozell Daniels. I'm wondering, is there another section where we talk about jobs, or does the jobs portion of this discussion fit inside of this economy and private industry part of it?
I think the jobs would fit squarely in this one as well.
Okay, all right. Well, we just might take note that there's not a strong mention of the importance of maximizing access to high-paying, good jobs, especially in the new industry economies, energy economies that people are talking about for Louisiana residents. I think that's something that is consistently brought up in all the climate conversations that we're having, and want to make sure that it's centered in this discussion, right? It should be jobs first for Louisianans in as much as we're creating these new economies.
Absolutely, that's a
Great point. I will note that in the Louisiana residents and communities section, there's a fundamental objective of maximizing job creation and support for the workforce. So that was captured on another slide, even though it's not
great.
captured.
Yeah, I figured I missed it. I just wanted to. I did just want to bring it up. Thanks for that. And certainly, in as much as there are equity goals around that, as far as geography, race, and gender, that would be, I think, important as well.
I think that's just another good point in terms of the work that we still have to do as a planning team to kind of reframe and kind of regroup these together, so we make sure that we're presenting everything in the most comprehensive way possible too. So I think we're looking to do that. So thanks for that comment.
Definitely, that's a great point to raise. The economy and private industry should be closely tied with jobs as well. So we'll be sure to include that. Any other notes on economy?
Okay, well then I'll go on to the next one, which is natural resources and the environment. And so just like the conversations elicited a strong desire to be people-centric, we also heard a lot about raising the need to make sure we are preserving our rich environmental resources as well throughout the different meetings. So the first one here is to maximize the preservation of natural resources, which came up with the Land Use and Buildings and Housing Committee and the manufacturing industry. And so here, means objectives would include a focus on wetlands or urban wetlands and also waterway corridors. And then the second fundamental objective in this section is maximizing environmental stewardship and supporting healthy ecosystems there. So, I mean, means in this category would include sustaining healthy ecosystems, reducing local environmental impacts from manufacturing, and minimizing or avoiding negative environmental impacts from emissions reduction strategies. So those were just two in this category, but things we heard throughout the meetings. Does anybody have any questions or additions here?
May I add something just on this one?
Please.
I'm remembering a comment by Chief Sherrill at the first task force meeting just around traditional ecological knowledge. And I just wanted to bring that up here, because I think as we talk about maximizing this preservation, there might be many ways to do it. And I just think it should be noted in this space. I just wanted to bring that up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair? This is
Yes,
Robertson.
Professor.
Yeah, I am late to the party, but I have a comment about the economic objectives, and it was a comment that Flozell made, and one that Colette Pichon Battle made a little earlier that reminded me of that. I think that first, I really think that it's important to focus on job creation, and I think that that might be an invitation to incorporate the ideas of unions or some sort of union representation. That's one idea. And the second idea is that I'm looking at the fundamental objectives under Louisiana residents, and it says increase job growth and protection of existing jobs. And I think that's a great start, but I wonder a little bit if that second part, protecting existing jobs, might actually conflict with the first part, which is growing new sectors. And if it's possible that the new jobs and new sectors are better jobs and better for a community, then I think we want to have room to allow for transition of one group of workers into another area where they actually might be better served. And the community might be too. That's the only point I wanted to make.
Yeah, great point. And I think we'll certainly try to harmonize that if we can, and then recognizing that there may be some conflicting fundamental objectives, but that the main point is to have them up front and be aware of them, and maybe that's the task force is fine with kind of making that transition, and thinks it's would be good policy, and so really. Yeah, great point, and we'll try to harmonize that.
Thanks. No, that's a good point you make too.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Moving on to our last category, which is climate change adaptation. We had briefly talked about this category earlier with Mr. Calabota's point that he raised. And though this effort is focused primarily on the mitigation of greenhouse gases, this piece of adaptation was brought up, as you can see, from many different groups. And so we're reflecting what was brought up in those conversations. And we also understand the interconnectedness between mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and its impacts as well. And so two fundamental objectives raised from some of the groups include increasing resilience of infrastructure to climate change and increasing resilience of communities to climate change. And on the infrastructure side, some means to reach this objective included reducing negative impacts of sea level rise, protecting critical resources, and security of access to power and energy. And in creating resilience for communities, it was identified that means to reach that objective could be reducing flood risk to communities, maximizing resilience of coastal communities in particular, and enabling disaster recovery. So these were the two components identified on adaptation from the task force as a whole, from the land use committee, from the manufacturing and industry and power committee, as well as the legal advisory group. So with that, I'll take any questions or additions on adaptation.
Hey, Lindsay, Tyler Gray again. Just in line with a lot of the other comments we've had, increasing the resiliency of infrastructure to climate change is a great opportunity to have a job creation and economic stimulus around infrastructure projects. Just something to consider in there as we look at workforce development and any sort of energy field. It would be great to include infrastructure in that as well, because it's an important piece.
Thank you for raising that, Tyler. And that's a great point to make, that a lot of these objectives should work and complement one another. So we'll definitely be working to tie them together to one another, and also tie them into the governor's overall vision and the work of his task force more broadly across categories.
I have one comment too. And that is the resilience reminds me of the discussion of reliability in some of the earlier goals that have to do with power production, for electricity production. And in certain circles in power production, reliability means something maybe slightly different from resilience. Reliability might be short-term consistency of power availability, and resilience might be long-term or reliability under extreme circumstances, like during a storm or something like that. And so I might, it strikes me that maybe the word resilience might be something that accompanies the word reliability when we talk about power availability, because I think they're getting at the same thing, but the time frames are different, at least as I understand it.
Thank you for that.
Lindsay, hey, this is Virginia. One other note here on climate change adaptation. You know, the way these two bullets are worded is to look at the resilience of communities and infrastructure that I guess could be enhanced with the strategies. But there's a flip to this, and it's the concept of maladaptation, wherein adaptation actually causes a positive feedback to warming or greenhouse gas emissions. One example, levee construction in the coast can cause the drainage and drying out and oxidation of soils that can release carbon into the atmosphere. So, you know, and it's kind of becoming evident that, you know, having an adaptation plan that's fully fleshed out, like you have on the mitigation plan, would really be nice. So you could look at it for those types of consequences, but it's just something that we all need to be cognizant of, is that adaptation can have consequences on mitigation strategies. So it's the reverse as well as the positive.
Thank you for raising that.
Does that make sense?
So you're mentioning that maladaptation, it can cause negative impacts
on the emissions strategies. Yeah, it can enhance emissions. And that example I gave of levees constructed to adapt to coastal flooding and reduce risk for communities. The wetland soils hold a lot of carbon. And so if the soils are drained, which is like what caused New Orleans to sink, you know, the drainage of these highly organic soils. So so it's a consequence on the state's emissions caused by adaptation. So it's just another facet of adaptation that we should keep in mind.
Absolutely.
Another example of that, if I could just add, is, you know, if you rely, for instance, on pumping systems to adapt to a wetter environment, those pumps are going to require electricity, and then you're going to be burning maybe more fossil fuel and creating more greenhouse gases. So yeah, I think we need to keep our eye on that. I'm really glad Dr. brought that up.
Chief Giroux here. I'm actually going to submit further in writing on this topic. One thing that I do not see mentioned with the adaptation is we do, in fact, have communities that are realistically facing resettlement. I'm sure we're all very aware of that. And that is a very real thing that we have to consider, as especially in regards to tribal and indigenous communities and preserving cultural aspects, and of course their right to self-determination. So again, I haven't seen that mentioned here, but I'll be glad to provide further comment on that in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. I really greatly appreciate that. Any other components that members see missing? So I think that covers all of our fundamental objective categories. that we had listed. And with that, I'll hand it back over to our chairman.
Thank you, Lindsay and Charles. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for your comments. Please submit any written comments to staff before the end of the year so they can work those in to an updated list for review in the January meeting. We'll plan to circulate that before, to give everybody ample time to review and kind of sit with it and offer their additional feedback. So I recognize that it is 12:04, just a quick time check. We have about to be at agenda item number 10, an update on Louisiana's greenhouse gas inventory by David Dismukes, which is very exciting update. I do want to, we have two other presentations listed, an update on Louisiana's comprehensive energy plan by Jason Longclos, and then an update on DNR's carbon capture and storage ad hoc committee. And if it is all right with you, Mr. Longclos, I propose, and maybe this is being too ambitious, that I would like to cover certainly the inventory, but because the ad hoc committee is currently on meeting and there are ongoing meetings, I just wanted everybody to be aware and try and have Mr. Canfield present on that just to for everybody's awareness, just so they don't miss a meeting in the interim while we wait. So that is all right with you, Mr. Longclos. We will plan to table that, and when we get to agenda item number 11.
Harry, that sounds great. That's no problem at all. Look forward to presenting at the next meeting. No issues whatsoever.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And with that, so a key component of this effort is being led by science, and that is updating the state's greenhouse gas inventory. LSU Center for Energy Studies conducted the state's first inventory in 2000 and updated it in 2010. And with contributions from DEQ, DNR, LED, and CPRA, the state will be commissioning LSU Center for Energy Studies to update the inventory once again. This update will be completed over the next 6 months. But in the meantime, the Nature Conservancy was able to get the ball rolling with respect to the power production component of the inventory, which I believe Mr. Dismukes will cover at a pretty high level in his presentation. Ms. Gautreaux, we greatly appreciate TNC's commitment to and support of science as a critical component of making informed decisions. And so before Mr. Dismukes begins, would you like to offer any comments or remarks, Ms. Gautreaux?
I'll just say that we were happy to provide resources to get this important study started, and I'm glad David is able to present to you, and I'll just keep it short since being cognizant of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I will turn it over to you, David.
Can you hear me, Harry?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay. All right, I want to make sure my microphone, I've been having some technical issues. So good morning, everybody. I'd like to go through a couple of slides that what I'd like to do this morning is just to give you an overview on historic trends in Louisiana CO2 emissions. I don't know if everybody's quite as familiar with them, so I thought I'd start out at a very high level talking about some of those trends. As Harry mentioned earlier, talk about the last study that we did in terms of collecting and compiling the greenhouse gas inventory, to talk about how this 2020 inventory will be similar, but in many ways will differ. And then as Harry and Karen both talked about, is giving you some high level results from our power generation analysis that we've done. For those of you that have heard me speak before, I am probably one of the fastest talking people in the state. I do recognize that we got a lot of time, so I am going to try to clip through this pretty quickly. But Harry's going to make these slides available to everybody. So there is a lot in here, and a number of them are pretty busy. But I'm more than happy to follow up with you at your own convenience and at some other time in the future if you'd like as well. So Harry is going to make those available. So don't think this is the last time you're going to get to see them or kind of study and review them in any more detail. Let me start off again, as I mentioned before, some of our historic trends and just kind of comparing some of the gains that we've made in terms of standardized emissions, that is looking at CO2 emission CO2 equivalent emissions, total greenhouse gas emissions on both a gross domestic product and a gross state product basis. And you can see that we lagged a little bit percentage-wise going through the 90s and the early part of the last decade, but kind of accelerated up some and a little bit behind, but do keep in mind the nature of our emissions are a little bit different. So you would expect to see some diminishing returns given the fact that we rely, particularly in our power sector, on some very beneficial fuels from an emissions perspective, including nuclear and natural gas. If you look at what we refer to as our emissions per heat input, that is what we're burning here in the United States, and maybe in Louisiana, and compare that to the United States, you can see that overall we've held relatively steady at somewhere around 70% or so of overall U.S. emissions in terms of pounds per heat input. That is all the BTUs of energy that are actually combusted. Those numbers have been going down a little bit for the U.S., and that has to do with the retirement of a lot of coal facilities and the addition of renewables in the power space. But you can see us in total have been relatively good and been relatively competitive. If you look at where we stand relative to total U.S. emissions, we tend to account for about 5% of those and continue to account for those. We were down in the early part of the decade, a little bit higher now. And again, I think that has to do more with the change in what's going on at the national level than it is any big deterioration of what's going on here at the state. And as you'll see as I move through some of these slides, particularly in the power sector, we've seen some considerable improvements in emissions, both on a heat input and an output basis, primarily due to some of the efficiency opportunities that were spoke about a little bit earlier. However, for us, the opportunities for reducing emissions are a little bit different than what you see at the national level. These are the historic trends by major sector, and you can see that a very large portion of those emissions that we have in the state are concentrated with industry and not so much in, say, power generation. We do not have a considerable amount of coal-fired generation here in the state like you see on average at the U.S. and in some concentrated areas on a regional basis. And so that has afforded us a little bit of a benefit. Likewise, we have a very, very heavy concentration of chemical industries and refineries here in the state, as well as a lot of other supporting infrastructure that has been added on in the last several years. If you look at about $64 billion in new capital investment in these industries and an expansion of output that has occurred concurrent with that investment, to see those emissions only creep up by a small amount ought to be something that is kind of a positive thing to look at in this, particularly when you figure some of these facilities like in ammonia have doubled their productive size and are some of the largest facilities in the world here in South Louisiana. I think this pie chart for 2018, looking at CO2 emissions between the U.S. and Louisiana, really drives home the differences between some of our challenges on an emission basis versus the U.S. averages. Again, electric power is about 35% of that total, and industry is about 17%. Compare that with Louisiana, where industry comprises about 66% of that. So when we start thinking about solutions and really going after the lowest hanging fruit or the biggest bang for our dollar, these are going to be some sectors that we're going to have to pay attention to. Electric power is certainly still important at 13%, but certainly nowhere near as large as what we've seen at the U.S. level, even in terms of 2018, where that U.S. level has improved a lot, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. Let's talk about the 2010 greenhouse gas inventory and what we did. This was a comprehensive study that we did. It was funded by Louisiana Department of Economic Development at the time. If you kind of go backwards to 2010, this was a time when we had in the last presidential administration where there was considerable proposed legislation in Congress to adopt national standards for greenhouse gas emissions. The Waxman-Markey bill was proposed during this time period. There were concerns about what that would mean for our industries here in Louisiana. So we went through and did a lot of the things that this task force is doing itself in terms of looking at what other policies are going on in the rest of the United States, assessing essentially the impacts that some of these regulatory schemes would have on our economy, and a potential list of strategies. The core thing that we did, though, in that study that Harry alluded to earlier was developing this greenhouse gas inventory, which updated some work that we had done a decade earlier almost. We utilized the EPA state inventory tool because it is commonly accepted. It has a number of standardized coefficients that are readily recognized and been vetted. So it would enhance transparency in the study that we did and the replicatability of the study that we did. We focused on the major CO2. We focused on CO2 emissions, but recognized all the greenhouse gases that are included in any GHG inventory, which include methane and nitrous oxide and some of the other pollutants that are involved with greenhouse gases. And at that time, we used 2005 for the inventory, primarily because a lot of the legislative proposals was tied to reductions relative to that 2005 base year. We used a lot of different data, as you can imagine. This is not an overly complex process from an analytic perspective, but it is very, very tedious, and it requires a lot of data from a lot of different sources to couple up with the coefficients that are included in the inventory tool itself. A wide range of information has to be pulled from the Energy Information Administration, which is the main collector of data associated with energy usage in the United States and the combustion of various different fossil fuels that is used in this analysis. We also used a great amount of information that comes from the Department of Natural Resources, some other climate analysis indicator tools, as well as at the time we had was a project advisory team. In this instance, as Harry alluded to earlier, we're going to be relying very heavily on the scientific advisory group to be providing us with input and direction and guidance that will serve in the same capacity that that advisory team did in the past. The 2010 study was segmented across a lot of different areas at the state level. We had a state level profile, looked at various different source specific emissions, sector specific, and then some projections in some areas. Keep in mind that when we were looking at 2005 and we were starting the study in 2010, you think about a major emission source for methane, which was the Haynesville Shale. That was something that was just starting to come to fruition at that time. We were just starting to drill a large number of those massive wells in 09 and 10. So we had to do a lot of projections, for instance, on Haynesville, whereas today when we do this study, we'll have the benefit of having actual information, a lot more specific information to figure out what those upstream methane emissions would be, which is a very potent greenhouse gas emission. Each of the subsections in our analysis had an overview, some of these historic trends that I showed you earlier, a data assessment, and some of the results. Not surprisingly, a lot of the emissions came primarily from the combustion of fossil fuels. For the state overall, we were looking at 228 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent on a gross basis. Net of the sinks, that was somewhere around 215 million tons. The vast majority associated, as I mentioned before, with the combustion of fossil fuel and various other greenhouse gases at much smaller percentages. In 2020, we're going to be looking at a lot of the same thing, but we're hoping to get a lot more granularity this go around to help the task force in terms of formulating its opinions and getting a good idea on even where within sectors where some of our challenges will be. As I mentioned before, industry is a very large component of this at 60 some odd percent. It certainly would be advantageous to drill down within that piece of the pie and find out what sectors within chemicals or within the refining sector are going to be the most important to look at, and we plan on doing that. Like the 2010 study, we'll be looking at all the relevant greenhouse gas emissions that are there, and we're going to be using a lot of the same sets and sources of information modified for the types of considerations that we need to think about here in Louisiana. In some instances, these tools are based on and look at information based on capacity measures. And in the energy business, that can be problematic because capacity and throughput may not necessarily match up with one another. And so we need to take that into account. Gas processing is a great example. Many of the gas processing facilities, particularly those located along the coast in South Louisiana, were developed and built for handling big volumes of gas production that were coming off the offshore Gulf of Mexico. As many of you are probably well aware, that production decline has been pretty rapid over the last 2 decades. And a lot of that capacity is underutilized. If you're not careful in how you look at that, you may wind up over-attributing greenhouse gases to that type of asset because you're using a capacity-based measure as opposed to a throughput-based measure. This is also important when you start thinking about mitigation tools and mitigation opportunities, because some of the carbon that comes out of that gas processing can be pretty pure. It can be a very important source that can be used and can be gathered pretty quickly for CCUS and some of the things that Jason has been working very hard on at DNR and other places. So those are some of the things that kind of feed in and are integrated in this analysis that are important, that I think, fortunately for us at the Center for Energy Studies, we have kind of some subject matter expertise in how things are burnt and used here on the fossil fuel side of the business. And we plan on bringing that to bear in this analysis, much like we did in the last one. There are a number of different sectors that are used in the implementation in the analysis tool that EPA has. Ammonia and urea is going to be an important one for our sector. We do plan on trying to break this out a little bit more into sectors on the industrial side that are going to be more important for us. And breaking those out. A lot of what we're going to use to condition that is going to be some of the work that we've done over the last 2 years on some grant-funded work for the National Energy Technology Laboratories, doing feasibility studies for CCUS in the state. And you can see this kind of decomposition within our primary sectors here, mostly within the chemical industry in the dark purple, and refining here, which is in the lighter purple. Breaking these out across time and looking at those time trends to see who's moving where and what in any given year, because you're going to have business fluctuation and operations in any given year. So you don't want to base this on any one single year as well. And again, this is just an example of some of the detail and granularity that we're hoping to get into, and to bring some of this work that we did in our feasibility study for CCUS into this particular work as well. And then getting down to the plant level. And you're going to see some more detail like this when we get into the power sector. You can see, for instance, in identifying sources for CCUS opportunities. Ammonia manufacturing is obviously a big one. You look at the CF facility, which is one of the largest of its kind in the world. It has over 14 million tons of potential opportunities just in stationary combustion, with another 21 million in ammonia. And again, breaking out these emissions by type, whether it's stationary combustion or through production processes, is also important, as I mentioned before, because it can have issues associated with the quality of the CO2 coming out and what we can do with that from a sequestration perspective, as well as a reuse perspective, and turning some of this potentially into other value-added commodities. In the ag module, we'll be working with a lot of different stakeholders in many of the same areas that we worked in before, in terms of releases from agricultural soils, from residue burning, from quote unquote manure management, and many other things. We'll also be working in land use changes in the forestry and the modules there. We've already been in touch with the Science Advisory Group with Virginia and Mark in particular about really pumping up these two sectors and taking into account not only the emissions that come out of them, but also having a really high quality analysis of the sinks that go along with this, and using some of the state-of-the-art improvements in understanding these sinks that have been made over the last decade. And again, looking at waste management, we have a module for that as well. So that we'll be going through many of those. And again, I hope in some sectors, really focusing in a lot of detail, even down at the plant level and the regional level, so that we have a lot of tools that you all can work with. What is the current status of what we've been doing? Well, we're compiling all the coefficients right now in the data. However, most of our activity, as Harry talked about before, has been focusing on getting this first set of analyses done, which is on the power generation sector. And what I'd like to do is kind of turn into that and talk some about some of those preliminary results that we've kind of passed off to. And again, a big shout out to Karen and the Nature Conservancy and Lisa there for helping us out in terms of funding this and getting this going. It's an important sector, even though it's not as large as what you would see at the national level. You can see Louisiana in the gold in terms of trend. Keep in mind that in keeping with most of my very busy graphs, I've got two axes here. Louisiana's on the right-hand side, the US is on the left-hand side. So you've got some order of magnitude differences here between billions and million megawatt hours. But it gives you an idea of the trends in generation, what in generation creates emissions. So where have we been in terms of historic generation? You can see the US flattening out. This is an interesting trend that we've seen and continue to see over the last decade or so on US power generation. We have kind of bucked that trend recently and have increased. And a lot of that has to do with kind of the shaded area that I've called in here that has to do with our industrial growth. If you look at use per customer on the residential side, the commercial side, that is relatively flat. And in some instances, in some areas, it's actually going down, not necessarily in Louisiana, but in other places, as more states move and aggressively pursue energy efficiency opportunities, appliance efficiency standards improve, those kinds of things, fuel switching, all those kinds of things have contributed to this flattening that we've seen here in load over the last decade or so. If you focus this on the generation that we have exclusively oriented to fossil fuels, you can see that dramatic trend for the U.S. overall going down as we retire primarily coal plants and some older steam units that are primarily fueled by natural gas. Our numbers have gone up primarily to meet those new loads that we have here in Louisiana. But as you'll see in a little bit, the marginal contribution to emissions that these facilities have had are lower than average and have actually improved where we stand on an emissions basis relative to those historic trends. This chart examines where our thermal efficiencies have been for power generation in the state. You can see dating back to 2009, if you're looking at natural gas thermal efficiencies, which I'm focusing on because so much of our generation comes from natural gas, we were around 10,000 BTUs for every kWh we were generating. You look at the substantial improvement that's been made not only at the US level, but also in the state of Louisiana. That's about a 26-27% improvement, all the way down below an 8,000 heat rate, which is a pretty dramatic change. And a lot of that has to do with the retirement of facilities, the repowering of facilities that many utilities have done in the state, particularly Entergy. I think this is a good example of the improvements that supply side efficiency can have on fuel use and combustion, and in turn on emissions that Jonathan was talking about in his presentation earlier, and Bill were when they were talking about the power sector. And this has, I think, analogs into manufacturing and industry as well. As you think about doing things more efficiently, can have pretty considerable impacts overall when it comes to emissions. The other thing that's important about Louisiana on the power side that is unique with us is we have a very high percent of our generation that comes from what is referred to as combined heat and power. And that is, industries in our state make a very important contribution. As much as 20% of our overall generation come from these combined heat and power facilities where they used waste heat as an efficiency application to drive down costs and to make additional electricity, for lack of better words. And we have some of the highest shares in the United States. And we also have seen those levels improve over the last several years, despite the fact that the national trend has been going down. So when you think about the supply side efficiencies that we get from our utility sector alone, as well as the supply side efficiencies and power that we have from industry, those are two important contributions that have helped to drive down overall power sector emissions. Again, you look at these efficient units on a per unit basis and look at the efficiency amounts. We do have some high efficiency units out there. There's still some more gains to be made. But do keep in mind when you're looking at some of these units that are running 19, 20, 20,000 plus heat rates, those are facilities that are typically not operating at a very high level. They're usually there for standby purposes during extreme winter events. And so they're not running 87, 60 hours a day, 60 hours a year. They're running very infrequently. And some of these other facilities that you look at in here, these are your low heat rates. These are the ones that are very good. These are your higher heat rate ones, the ones that could use some of these are based on a function of their technology. Big Cajun is a coal plant. It's a steam unit. It's not going to have efficiencies that are going to look like a combined heat and power application like you're going to see over here at Exxon, for instance. So you do need to keep those kinds of considerations in play as well. It's just not a simple, hey, put on a new recovery unit and boom, you get a new heat rate. As I mentioned before, you go back to 2008, electric power was a very big, important sector. One of the reasons why we pushed a lot of fuel switching into natural gas and renewables. For Louisiana, 64% of our emissions, however, came primarily from industry, not from electric power. You can see that number somewhere around 15% back in 2008. Switch that to today, or more recent to today in 2018, you can see that electric power has come down considerably in terms of overall share of emissions at the national level. And again, this has a large part to do with closing down coal facilities, closing down steam, and moving to renewables. Our number of industry still pretty much consistent, and the same with electric power, maybe down a little bit from 15% down to about 13%. Let's get to the bottom line, which are emissions. You can see those emissions peaking up in about 2011 or so and coming down considerably by about peaking out at about 46 million tons and falling by as much as 27% during that time period. And again, keep in mind, we're looking at US scales over here, and we're looking at Louisiana here on the right-hand side. If we look at the emissions per heat input, again, spiking up. This is during Katrina when we were running units in a way that we usually don't tend to run those. That was essentially an all hands on deck kind of situation right there. We're running everything we could, but you can see those tending to go down. Again, for every MMBTU of energy we're using, we're getting lower and lower emissions. And again, looking at those emissions on an output basis or per megawatt hours, we've been following trends that are very comparable to the US averages, which have been very rapidly falling over the last decade. So again, a lot of this having to do with improving those supply side efficiencies at the units that we've burned. Not only does this have an important implication for emissions, but Bill was talking earlier about the importance of affordability and utility rates. When you drive down the MMBTUs of fuel that you burn to make a megawatt hour, not only do you reduce emissions, but you reduce fuel costs and you drive those down as well. So you get a twofer there in terms of improving efficiencies and improving emissions as well. So these things don't have to be mutually exclusive, and this is a good idea in the power sector of how that happens. Keep in mind, we're not in the top 10 for historic power generation emissions. Right now, we rank somewhere like, I think, in 18 or so. So it's something to kind of keep in mind when we're looking overall at our emissions profile relative to other states. When you look at our emissions on a per heat input basis, we're one of the better and more efficient ones. And I think it's a lot to think about when you look at this chart that shows Vermont and California as being lower, particularly when you look at Vermont and states like Massachusetts and Connecticut. We're running, I don't know, 28, 29 units, that individual facilities, and we're still down here at the lower part. Some of these states now only have a handful of fossil fire generators still left in them. Connecticut may have, 2, 3. Massachusetts may have a handful. So for us to be down here on the low side of this curve, still given this considerable amount of capacity and the number of units we have, I think is a lot to pat ourselves on the back for. We're a little bit higher, but still in the top 10 in terms of the lowest emissions per megawatt hour. And again, thinking about some of these other states, that's a pretty big step for us as well. Again, some of the detail, I won't go into this whole table, but we're able to take this down to the individual point level and certainly can do a lot of cuts in analyses and scenarios for the committee when we get to that point. We've been able to parse these out by the top 10 generators in the state in terms of the emissions amount. So if you're really trying to focus and target these, but keep in mind, these are in absolute levels. They're not in rate levels. So some of these facilities, while they may have very high amounts in total, do have some relatively high efficiencies that need to be offset on this as well. Great case in point is this Plaquemine cogen unit that's at the Dow facility across the river. And again, this is looking at those on a pounds per output basis. This was on an input basis. And again, that's the same thing. So what are the conclusions? Our emissions here comprise a smaller share overall of greenhouse gas emissions than the national average. I think something to take away when you're thinking about the power sector. So while renewables and things of that nature are important, the biggest bang for the buck in reducing a lot of those emissions probably going to be more oriented. Not that we can't do things in power, but industry is going to be probably the bigger target. We've relied on historically large shares of nuclear and natural gas to keep our emissions down. We also have very high shares of combined heat and power that are high efficiency generation opportunities in the state. Over the last decade, we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions in this sector alone by 27%. We've reduced them on a heat input basis by about 6%, and then on an output basis by about 21%. In terms of conclusions, what are we doing? I think Harry alluded to this timetable a little bit earlier, and I'll just kind of underscore that. We're starting to work with the Science Advisory Group. We're working with Harry and his office as well. We have some major milestones in terms of continuing the scoping with the Science Advisory Group for the next 1 to 3 months, getting our first cut of data and charts out by about 3 months, and kind of getting that into a more report form by 4 months. Getting the second version out in 5 months, and really finalizing this and coming back to you all with a final briefing and report in 6 months. This is my contact information if anybody wants to reach out to me and follow up on anything. And as I mentioned earlier, Harry is going to make all these slides available. So you will be able to get those. But if you want to talk issues or talk about some of the things that we're doing offline, feel free to email me or call me. It'd be good to email me, given the fact that I'm not on campus these days because of COVID. And Harry, I'll punt it back to you if y'all want to ask any quick questions or anything. I could do a couple.
Thank you so much, David. You weren't kidding about speaking fast, so thank you very much. It was a lot of content, and I know everybody's going to want to dig into those slides and in order to fully digest. And we'll certainly look forward to you interfacing with the Science Advisory Group along the way and coming back to this task force late in 2021. To report out on your findings. And so I will open it up to any questions, kind of recognizing that, well, I'll open up to any comments or questions.
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Yes, Professor.
I'll say quickly too. This was fabulous, and I really want to thank you for all this. A lot of information. You said that in terms of GHG output per heat unit, per heat input unit, that we ranked low nationally. But I'm wondering if you can tell us where we rank in terms of GHG output per capita. And the reason I'm asking is because you said at one point Louisianans put out 5% of GHG emissions, and yet we're not even 1.5% of the U.S. population. So I'm wondering what the per capita rate.
Yeah, so that number is going to be real high, primarily because you've got all those industrial amounts and single sources that you're attributing to a small 4 million person population. So yeah, there's lots of ways of standardizing these numbers. And if you look at it on a per person basis, we're going to be up probably in the top 3.
So the jobs created for Louisianans per GHG unit are probably pretty high too, right? Or I mean, we're producing a lot of GHGs for every job in that industry that goes to a Louisianan.
We would, yeah. But do keep in mind that we're generating and creating those GHGs to fund fuel that goes to Vermont and to Connecticut, and they're not getting. So I do think in the balance of looking at those things, it's something to keep in mind as well.
Thank you, David, for making yourself available. Definitely don't want to rush this, and I'm sorry. We stacked things up on the agenda with a lot of items. So I don't want the members to feel like we are trying to rush this through. So I appreciate you, David, making yourself available. The Science Advisory Group will certainly provide routine updates to the task force on the progress of the inventory, and we can leave it at that unless there are any other questions.
Mr. Chair, this is Tyler Gray.
Yeah.
I have a question for Dr. Dismukes quickly. Dr. Dismukes, you made a lot of references to 2005 and where we started those emissions. Can you elaborate, or how do you account for that was a year Katrina hit. We had a lot of the shutdowns as related to that. How does that function within your analysis with things being shut down and those emission level changes?
Well, I mean, I think that's why it's important to not look at just one single year alone. You look in the power generation sector alone, you see a big spike, and you're probably going to see that in other sectors. So moving across a lot of those different years are going to be important. So one of the things that we're going to do in this study is, rather than focus on a single year, we're going to bring the emissions inventory from the last time, from 2005 all the way through to where we can even get to most recently, which I think is going to probably wind up being 2018. And one of the things you're going to likely see is going to be an improvement of very different degrees across different sectors. So if you go back to industry, as you know, there have been a lot of collateral improvements that have had to be made in air emissions and other pollutants as well that have had benefits for CO2. Those are going to get reflected in some of that trend data as we move through time. I think another important point that you mentioned earlier too, Tyler, that you saw in the power sector that is important, I think, for all industries and manufacturing, and that is modernization. And to me, modernization is nothing more than efficiency gains and efficiency opportunities. And that is something else to keep in mind. It's something to look at. And you can kind of see it in some of those trends, is despite the fact that we've added hundreds of tons, or maybe even thousands of tons of new productive capability in the chemical sector, and thousands of barrels of distillation capacity in certain sectors in the refining business, those emissions have not gone up by super amounts. Whereas 10, 15, 20 years ago, you might see a much higher peak or spike on emissions as a consequence of that. So you think about the process of laying new pipe, for instance, new coated protected steel versus uncoated or unprotected steel, and methane leaks that can occur from corrosion by going in and replacing it with state-of-the-art and developing new state-of-the-art pipelines. All those are things that help develop lower emission profiles over time.
Any other questions? Thank you. Dr. Dismukes, apologize for not recognizing the PhD earlier, Dr. Professor. And with that, I will certainly share the slides with everybody, and thank you for bearing with us as we're trying to fit in an ambitious agenda. And thank you, Mr. Longclaw, for agreeing to present in the new year on the comprehensive energy plan that you are working on, DNR is working on. It is critically important. It is going to be running in parallel with a lot of the work that this task force is doing. And so we want to make sure that this group is aware and plugging in and, understanding sort of the symbiotic relationship between these two efforts. And so look forward to receiving a full report out on that in the new year. I do also, have Mr. Canfield, who with DNR also, who is going to be presenting on the CCUS ad hoc committee. And in order to do it justice, ask that he come back if he's willing to present at a later date. But I do want to give this group a high-level overview, or if Mr. Canfield could, because there are ongoing meetings, and so I just want everybody to be aware, and so that they can plug into that process if they so choose, and at least just be very aware. So we'll turn it over to you, Mr. Canfield.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you, task force members. So my name is Blake Canfield. I'm Executive Counsel for the Department of Natural Resources, and we have created an ad hoc committee which consists of 5 members. 4 of those are DNR employees from various offices, have different regulatory functions involved with geologic sequestration of CO2. And then the 5th member is Professor Keith Hall at LSU Law, who is studied some of the legal issues. Primarily, one of the main things he brings for us is property rights concerns and issues associated with geologic sequestration. And the group is trying to look at the existing laws that have previously been passed and regulatory programs that fall within DNR, and come up with recommendations on how best to administer those regulatory and other programs. And recognizing we don't have all of the answers, and we may not even have been able to spot all of the issues, we are trying to open this up for public input and for others to provide recommendations, ask questions, help us to see what issues are out there. I'll try to keep this very quick, but generally speaking, we're looking to find ways to successfully implement geologic sequestration in Louisiana as one tool for dealing with CO2 emissions. We also recognize that it's not the only tool and likely not not the largest tool out there, but it still sounds like it's an important tool that needs to be on the table. And we want to make sure that we're able to undertake those regulatory programs in a successful manner, which includes protecting the environment, public health and safety, includes clarifying the programs that exist, making sure that we're running them efficiently where possible, and also that we are doing so in a way that brings confidence to the public. So there's a lot more for me to talk about. I realize we're completely out of time, but I did want to mention these meetings are ongoing. We do not have an end date on this. We look at this as an ongoing process, but we are kind of looking at the possibility of legislation coming up in this next legislative session. And so there are, some deadlines that are associated with pre-filing bills. So we're trying to get a lot of the meetings at least done on kind of big ticket items in February of this coming year. We have our next meeting is actually tomorrow morning, and we will have meetings again in January. Probably the easiest thing to do is if you would like to participate, if you have comments, if you would like to just get notices of what we're doing and where we're at as we send those out, please email me. My email address is blake.camfield@la.gov. And I may ask if Harry and his crew could to send my contact information to you all. Feel free to email me. We'll add you to our interested parties list so that you can participate going forward. And so I guess with that and with a short period of time, Harry, I'm happy to come back and present on this in more detail in the next meeting. But thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you. That would be great. We'll look to schedule you in for some time in the new year. But if there are any pressing questions from the members, I'll open it up briefly for questions or comments. All right. Well, thank you very much, Mr. Canfield. So moving right along to next steps. So our plan is to circulate a draft interim report by the 15th of next month in order to give everybody a week to review it. We'll then hope to meet around the 22nd, which would then give staff another week to make any modifications as necessary before that February 1st deadline. Some of the advisory groups will likely meet in January, but we expect others and all of the committees to meet likely next in February. As a reminder, please send staff any comments on the fundamental objectives by the end of the year, so we can consider them as we continue to refine and synthesize that list. And with that, I believe we are now turning to our public comment portion of the meeting. And so we will take a 4-minute break in order to allow the public to type in and submit their comments. So we will resume at 12:47 and begin to read those public comments. But if there are any comments from the members, kind of closing comments, happy to take those as we wait. So as people may be collecting their thoughts, just a reminder to the public, please send your comments to climate@la.gov. And please note that this is in reference to the Climate Initiatives Task Force. And if you're commenting on a particular agenda item, please reference that. Please include your name and address as well, so we can identify you as the commenter. So we will begin to read those comments at 12:47. And actually going to call an audible because it seems like we do have a lot of public comments already. So we're going to get started and read them, and just be sure to refresh the email inbox before when we hit the last comment. So Lindsay, whenever you are ready, I know you're collecting your the emails. So whenever you're ready to read them out, we can get started.
Great idea, Chairman. And I'll start with the public comments we received in order that we received them. So we already have about 8 public comments. We might go 15 minutes or so with these, but I'll start with a public comment from Marion Frystad. See if I can open it. Okay, her public comment reads, I laud the governor's commitment to fight the inexorable climate crisis and its existential threat to significant parts of Louisiana. I also commend the enthusiastic participation of the industry, science, and government representatives in the effort. However, listening to the recording of the Mining, Oil, and Gas Committee meeting from December 15th, I was astonished and disturbed by the complete lack of knowledge that the oil and gas economy is dying. It seems the committee interpreted their charge as to seek ways to produce fewer emissions while continuing their slap-happy plundering of fossil fuels as one of the biggest producers of greenhouse gases in the country and world. This is like adding filters to cigarettes as a way to stop smoking. You're still going to die from cancer. The oil, gas, and fossil fuel economy is killing the planet. The governor, the task force, and the committees appear to acknowledge this, yet somehow want to find a way to continue to make a living, or should I say a killing from it. What we need is a way for fossil fuel economy to bow out of producing fuels for burning. We need to join the rest of the country and the world by becoming an energy, not a fossil fuel economy, and join the energy transition to renewables. This means funneling laid off fossil fuel workers in remediation, cleaning toxic sites, converting old refineries into new manufacturing venues. There is a sun, wind, wave, battery tech, research, and many more ways in which Louisiana could lead the nation instead of squeezing the last drops out of the planet-killing and ultimately suicidal economy. If the Oil Committee argues that this is not their purview, I respond that the hearing I watched spent a significant amount of time emphasizing a cooperative and cross-committee approach to achieve the governor's mandate. We need solutions, not turf wars. I also echo the public comments of Mike Triticchio, Scott Eustace, and Jane Patton. The conversation did not reflect the past, and existing fossil fuel economy has destroyed our economy and environment. Particularly, communities of color and composition of this committee does not reflect the diversity of this state. Thank you, Marion Penny Freistat. Members, our next public comment comes from Scott Eustace of Healthy Gulf. And his public comment reads, public comment to Climate Task Force on the importance of a true equity frame. Please forward links and attachment to individuals in the task force. And members, he provides attachments and links below, which I will send. As industrial emissions are the leading cause of the climate crisis and wetland loss into 2067, and Louisiana economic development seems primarily concerned with foreign direct investment projects that will radically increase Louisiana's carbon emissions, Louisiana economic development must undertake a sociological environmental justice analysis of the sites LED advertises as pre-certified for industrial development, thus radically promoting industrial emissions according to the latest EPA best practice, last updated in 2016 and last implemented by the New Orleans District of the Corps in 2017. See Bullard Council on Environmental Quality, Bayou Bridge Pipeline, Army Corps of Engineers, and EPA, the attachments he provides. The task force must recommend LED take this sociological analysis. The task force must recognize sociology as a scientific discipline and include sociological data in their analysis and in any recommendations, according to the Bullard and Wright et al. Methods published in Environmental Law, version 38, 2008. Each new proposal pre-certified by LED often seeks to increase Louisiana's carbon footprint by the equivalent of a small nation. I will highlight as one example of how issues are interrelated, the Formosa Plastic proposal in St. James Parish. The emissions from Formosa Plastic proposed alone, 13 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year, will exceed the emissions of every automobile in the state of Louisiana by a couple times. Formosa Plastics and other companies have identified Louisiana economic development as one source of the environmental racism in their site selection process. These new emission sites are slated to be the origin of the highest carbon emissions per capita in the US and perhaps the world. The emissions from these sites will far exceed the emission savings and mitigation from an electric Louisiana fleet or industrial carbon sequestration. LDEQ must deny these permits until the impacts to health, small business, and our coastal wetland via aggregated sea level rise have been assessed. And the task force should recommend that carbon-intensive applicants conduct these scientific reviews, sociological health impact, and local block group economic impact before air permits are approved. The task force should recommend that these permits be put on hold until such studies are conducted. The task force should recommend that LDEQ command these new facilities, all LNG export, plastic manufacturing, methanol manufacturing, and oil export proposals review climate impacts from CO2 equivalent in a programmatic or area-wide environmental impact statement. This would be the fastest and cheapest way to ensure that any science is involved in the state's decision on climate. These decisions are being made as we speak and will have been made by 2023. Anything less than this minimal environmental review is a dereliction of duty to the public trust. The task force must undertake this analysis for any carbon sequestration solution proposed. We note that the solution advertised as the magic bullet industrial CCUS placed in Louisiana is primarily an initiative of the Center for Houston's Future. We note that Houston's future seems to depend on piping CO2 waste out of Texas to be stored or dumped in Louisiana and Mississippi via the Denbury pipeline, according to an October 2020 report and associated presentations. See an attachment from the University of Houston. Often these climate emitting and carbon sequestration sites are in Native American villages or African American towns and will likely affect Black and Indigenous Louisianans disproportionately with cancer risk to young and old, including the unborn children. Many African Americans and Native American Black groups on the Gulf Coast and in Louisiana are suffering the largest cancer risk in the nation and the highest rates of death from cancer in the nation. These Louisianans are also disproportionately killed by the COVID-19 pandemic due to poor lung health. See an attachment entitled Compounding. CO2 pipelines and sequestration sites have been known health impacts and risk, which Houston seems to happily export to our state and to Mississippi. The task force must review the health impacts and health benefits of different methods of reducing carbon impacts. So the state will move towards choosing the emission drawdown solution with the largest co-benefits to the state's health and thus the state's economy. The EPA's BINMAP method is the simplest method to accomplish this analysis. These risks and health impact should be evaluated because they are intimately connected with the fact that local business growth has declined in the river parishes where most petrochemical development and most climate emissions have occurred, according to the U.S. Small Business Administration. As an example, residents in river parishes need their lung health to create and run small businesses, which is the largest source of jobs in Louisiana. Despite industrial developments like Nucor Steel in District 4 of St. James, local grocery stores and commercial establishments like Heimel Seafood have been shuttered since the industry arrived. In economic development departments, and efforts seem only to suppress these businesses like local grocery stores, which are essential to economic development and quality of life in Louisiana. The buildings of these former businesses still stands. Why is there no effort to bring food and jobs into District 4? Giving River Parish residents their lung health will likely be the fastest and most effective way to draw down climate emissions. And we hope the task force takes environmental justice frame rooted in sociology seriously. Additionally, Black and Indigenous Louisianans have suffered due to the erasure of their cultural sites, cemeteries, and grave sites. During the era of colonization in the Jim Crow era, Louisiana economic development must fund genealogy and historic investigations, analogous to the Texas Freedom Colonies Project. But for Louisiana, before advertising climate-emitting sites as ready for construction, the Texas Free Colonies Project is another example of Louisiana residents who have to leave the state to find work. The task force must consider what activities could bring Louisiana residents who have left the state due to lack of economic opportunity and quality of life back to the state. We request the task force respect the disciplines of archaeology and anthropology, and the greatest need for these kinds of research to preserve the culture of Louisiana against the forces of a changing climate and rising sea. For the last 7 years, we have seen the petrochemical companies that have always damaged Louisiana's climate also lead to divestment from Louisiana's economy. The rise of fracking in Texas led to layoff, wage stagnation, and abandoned wells and drill sites that are a growing climate liability to Louisiana. The fall of fracking in Texas has led to even more of the same. The task force cannot call for more bailouts to an industry which has bankrupted the state. Louisiana's future only lies in throwing off this yoke. Louisianans deserve an economy that serves them instead of one that hires Texans for the profits of Saudi Arabia. We look forward to the task force's recommendations as a path to develop Louisiana's economy for our own residents rather than Houston and rather than other nations. For a healthy Gulf, signed Scott Eustace. Scott offers another comment in regard to the greenhouse gas inventory regarding orphan wells. And his comment reads, the issue of orphan wells permanently, in quote, shut in for future use and abandoned wells appears to be missing from the LSU report. Louisiana legislative auditors provided a summary of orphaned wells, but not the other categories of wells that are likely to leak methane. All wells are likely to leak over the course of their life, and Louisiana has hundreds of thousands of oil and gas wells. The cement casing on these wells needs to be reviewed every 30 years. Louisiana is littered with abandoned wells, as well as wells that have been shut in for future use for decades, even longer than my lifetime. Future use wells must be immediately reviewed for methane emissions and sealed against methane emissions. Current reports put Texas oil fields at a waste leak rate of 3 to 4% of gas produced. If industry standards are that low for current wells, it's hard to imagine that abandoned, orphan, and future use wells in Louisiana are better cared for. All wells must be reviewed for methane emission every 30 years and sealed against these emissions. The Climate Task Force should recommend that the abolition of shut-in future use category for oil wells that have not been used for 10 years. Despite the industry's promise of tens of thousands of jobs, The oil industry has laid off tens of thousands of oil workers from Louisiana since the rise of fracking in 2013. There are many Louisianans idled by the oil industry with some oil field experience and sometimes much oil field experience. Since 2013, most of them have to leave the state to work. Reviewing and plugging these orphan wells is an obvious program to hire these oil workers to work within Louisiana rather than Texas or North Dakota, and ensure that methane leaks are kept at a minimum. The Climate Task Force should conduct a sociological review as well as a greenhouse gas impact review of an action to hire back Louisiana oil workers to our state from oil fields in other states in order to review wells and seal methane leaks. Signed, Scott Eustace. Another comment offered from Healthy Gulf on the emission inventory is in regard to sand and gravel mines. And this comment reads, the LSU and LED greenhouse gas report omits the former wetland forests that have been converted into sand mines. It discusses former coal mines, but not former sand mines. Attached are government studies, including the previous governor's task force on this issue. This issue was reviewed in 1992 as a cause of flash flooding along the Amite River, including a threat to Denham Springs. Denham Springs has only grown during that time, and the threat realized in 2016 climate rains that led to billions in damage. The LDEQ and other initiatives discussed were to reduce pollution and control flooding from mines. But wetland restoration, and particularly wetland forest restoration, is a powerful carbon sequestration technique when the accounting is done correctly. Louisiana DNR has a small department to study this issue from mine safety perspective and not a climate or wetland perspective. That office is vastly overwhelmed and underfunded, although it has valuable experience. These abandoned sand mines are concentrated on the Amite, Tangipahoa, and Boga Chitto rivers, and even within our scenic rivers. Mining has removed tens of thousands of acres of forested wetlands that could be efficiently replaced. These lands are some of Louisiana's greatest tools to sequester carbon and mitigate flooding. The acreage for these coastal wetlands is in the tens of thousands, smaller but on the scale of marsh restoration projects currently in the state's coastal master plan. These coastal plain forests should also be a part of the coastal plan. Restoration of these mines to wetland forests is an extremely cost-effective way to sequester carbon in the coastal forest wetlands. Real estate interests to date have been opposed to this wetland restoration despite the flood risk benefits to people and housing on real estate. The Army Corps is currently reconsidering the Darlington Dam, which would be a serious danger for St. Helena and Livingston Parish residents, including Denham Springs, if the rainfall of 2016 were to occur again. That dam project would also preclude much of this wetland forest restoration by covering those acres in water for the purpose of real estate development. The Army Corps and the Amite River and Tributaries Project authorization has been explicitly ordered by the previous U.S. Congress to ignore nature-based flood risk reduction solutions because of the previous cost-benefit analyses that encourage wetland restoration. The state is under no such order and must act to protect its scenic rivers and act on behalf of its climate as well as its wetlands. We request the Climate Task Force review the wetland forest restoration potential in the Amite, Tangipahoa, and Boga Chitto rivers in accordance with the Louisiana Scenic Rivers Act, and work with mine owners to restore abandoned mines to floodplain forest, as envisioned in the 1992 Governor's Task Force on Abandoned Mines. We request the Climate Task Force review the Core Darlington Dam project, Amite River and Tributaries project, and explore wetland carbon sequestration along these scenic rivers as an alternative flood risk reduction measure. And Scott provided some attachments there that we'll provide for members. A final comment on from Healthy Gulf by Scott Eustace is on the financial importance of carbon efficient reductions on the matter of stranded assets. And his comment reads, please see the attached fault lines, a study that breaks down of the stranded asset vulnerabilities of carbon emitting companies by company. Many of these companies are the source of carbon emissions in Louisiana, part of the 49% identified by LAD-LSU. Shell Convent was allowed to expand pollution and emissions in 2015, becoming less efficient. Before closing, the expansion of Shell Convent destroyed hundreds of acres of irreplaceable Maurepas swamp. This was justified by Shell in statements that implied the facility would remain operational for at least 10 more years. The facility will be closed in February of 2021, less than 5 years after the expansion. Such inefficiency permitted by DEQ put that facility first in line to be severed from Shell's assets as the company sought to maintain financial solvency, resulting in the unemployment of hundreds of Louisiana residents and a lowering of state and parish revenue. This obviously affects the cost and benefit of these facilities to the public and thus is under LDEQ's purview as well as other agency purviews. Louisiana must review these climate pollution sources not only as 49% of Louisiana's climate pollution, but also in terms of their ability to be cut from a multinational portfolio as the out-of-state companies deal with their stranded assets. Most manufacturing in Louisiana is owned by entities outside of the state, and these entities will be looking globally to shed assets in order to become solvent. Petrochemical manufacturing should be lighter and tighter in order to survive. The task force should identify this stranded asset issue as worthy of study company by company. The task force should order LDEQ to conduct a fragility analysis of polluting facilities as part of their public interest duty. For a healthy Gulf, signed Scott. Our next public comment comes from Andy Kowalski on agenda item 8. And his comment reads, as an advocate who works in the public interest to promote access to affordable clean energy and the multitude benefits in industry, I am grateful to all the task force members gathered today. After all, a key benefit to energy resources like solar, wind, energy storage, and a robust energy grid to support and provide access to these resources is that they provide energy without emitting greenhouse gases. This fact is as indisputable as the fact that fossil fuel contributes to climate change. These are proven technologies that are commercially viable and affordable. They also employ as many as 611,000 people nationally, with an additional 3 million employed in energy efficiency. It doesn't take much more than a few Google searches to see that there is already an energy transition happening. But how well planned that transition happens is critically important. The primary role of this task force, whether explicitly stated or not, is to manage a transition from a carbon-intensive economy to a net zero economy. With any transition, it's important that there is consideration of risk. The recent task force on climate-related financial disclosures recently coined the term transition risk, which exemplifies the financial impact of so-called stranded assets. These are fossil fuel assets largely that will be rendered uneconomic from competition with lower cost resources and a general shift in the financial community away from these resources. This is an incredibly important concept in energy transition to maintain fiscal solvency. But there are ways to plan for this future if a plan for retirement of assets is considered. This is also an incredibly important concept for workers who depend on jobs in industries that may have stranded assets in the future. But again, there are ways to plan for their future as well. Consider the scale of job losses, which skills are transferable, and how to implement workforce development for new skills. It's critical that we don't simply consider this to be a far-off probability. It is increasingly not a far-off probability. There is a second kind of transition risk that I consider important as well as the purely financial risk, and that is the risk of choosing unproven technologies that are not commercially scalable. There's a bad analogy that's made often with climate change that it's like the space race, but there's a very big difference. We are not in a race with the Russians to reach the moon. We are in a race with the natural world to lower carbon emissions in time to avert extreme impacts to the entire human population on a scale that we've never seen. Climate change is a time-limited crisis, and entertaining solutions that are not proven is a risk that we can't afford to take. I urge this task force to consider a path to decarbonization that is based in reality, with technologies that can be deployed at scale in a commercially viable and safe manner. We have time to plan correctly if we use our time wisely, but if we don't, we will have a very small window to make some very complicated decisions. I look forward to the continued development of objectives for the task force, but I hope we can consider solutions that can be deployed reliably, affordably, and swiftly. Thank you. Signed, Andy Kowalski of Sustainable Energy Economic Solutions. Our next public comment comes from Nathan Lott, and his comment reads, good morning. Thank you for your service to Louisiana on this task force. Last week, I submitted a letter with some sketch recommendations, which I trust you will review. At Preservation Resource Center of New Orleans, we are invested in your success. We recognize buildings are directly responsible for almost 40% of carbon emissions, And we also know that existing and historic buildings are tools for climate action. Louisiana can leverage our existing buildings to meet emission targets in at least two ways. One, by reducing their operational carbon emissions through energy efficiency retrofits, and two, by maximizing building reuse to avoid carbon emissions from conventional new construction. We can take complementary action to shift our building and manufacturing sectors towards low carbon and carbon storing materials for both new construction and renovation. By doing these things, Louisiana can reap economic and social co-benefits such as good jobs in designing, constructing, and manufacturing. Secondly, greater impacts from public spending on housing and infrastructure. And third, decreased financial strain on low and moderate income utility users. The first step is to accurately measure emissions associated with the built environment. Next is to align current spending on housing, infrastructure, and public buildings with our climate goals. New incentives should follow. Preservation professionals can help identify best practices for Louisiana's climate and building stock. Historic places are already being affected by the impacts of climate change, and many of them can be part of the solution. I look forward to working alongside the task force to that end. Thank you. Signed, Nathan, from Preservation Resource Center of New Orleans. Our next public comment comes from Logan Atkinson Burke in regard to the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And her comment reads, "Thank you to all members of this task force who are taking your charge seriously to find real actionable solutions to the existential crisis that climate change presents to Louisiana. This state has a long history of storytelling about our energy economy. Those stories have cemented an increasingly false idea that traditional energy resources represent our state's whole economy and identity. We know that this is not true. We know that our people, land, and economy are so much more than fossil fuels. With that said, as a self-identified energy state, it is surprising Louisiana had never had a comprehensive statewide energy plan until now. We are glad to see the Department of Natural Resources taking action to address the need for such a plan, especially since vital Department of Energy funds for programs that can help Louisiana meet emission reduction target goals require an energy plan. Louisianans have made it clear that they are supportive of a different kind of energy state with a more diversified economy. For example, where tens of thousands of residents and businesses use the state's short-lived credit for rooftop solar. They continue to make it clear when they use all available efficiency dollars each year and buy more and more hybrid and electric vehicles. Louisianans who have been harmed by the status quo are now asking for a just transition to a future, not just more of the same. Unfortunately, the request for proposals for our state's first comprehensive energy plan just sustain the old story. 3 out of 4 of the goals and objectives in the plan's RFP put fossil fuels first, and the RFP neglects to acknowledge climate change or the health, safety, and economy risk of continued focus on a volatile sector that has negatively impacted so many in our state. I urge the Department of Natural Resources to revisit the goals and objectives of the state's first energy plan to align with this climate task force emission goals, and to enable the work of this task force and public demand to inform future energy plans. Likewise, I urge this Climate Initiatives Task Force to consider a realistic state energy plan as an important part of reaching the state's goals." Thank you, signed Logan of the Alliance for Affordable Energy. And members, our last public comment is from Ben Quimby in regard to the greenhouse gas inventory. And his comment reads, "Hello, my name is Ben Quimby and I live in New Orleans. First, I would like to thank all the task force members for their time and effort. To the extent that it is possible, I was wondering if it would be possible to get an explanation accessible to lay people of how data is collected for the GHG inventory, including how the EPA SIT tool works. I realize collecting this inventory is a very complex task, but also one that is crucial given the task force's focus on emission reduction, benchmarking progress and understanding where Louisiana's emissions are coming from. As I understand it, the EPA SIT provides aggregated sector level data, not data for individual sources or facilities. Reuters reported earlier this month, with the link included below, that inaccuracies from EPA air monitoring data are common and that EPA air monitors have often failed to observe and or record such as explosions that have resulted in large emissions. To what extent does data for the inventory rely on such monitors, and how can we use that most accurate data how can we ensure that the most accurate data is collected? And what limitations are there to the methodology used? Given the importance of emission reduction to the task force goals, helping to make this process more accessible to the public would be important and greatly appreciated. Thank you. Signed, Ben. And members, I believe that is all of our public comments. You just check one more time. And with that, I'll turn it back over to our chair to close us out.
Thank you very much for reading those comments, Lindsay, and thank you to the commenters for submitting them. They're very, we appreciate your engagement and hope that you continue to engage with this task force moving forward. And so we now are at the end of our agenda. I apologize again for us running over. We'll make sure we recalibrate for future meetings. But are there any final comments from members? Otherwise, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Take it. Motion to adjourn.
Motion. There's a motion on the table from Ms. Gotro. Any second?
Second.
All right. Second by Mark Moses. All in favor, say aye.
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 Aye. Thank you very much. Have a happy holidays, and we'll be in touch and circulate all the information kind of for moving forward and the presentations that were given here today. Take care, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.